Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 is one of the most frustrating video games that I have ever played. And I don't mean to sound hyperbolic here. I genuinely enjoyed maybe less than 10% of what this game had to offer. The game is a terrible successor to Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines. This has been openly talked about since even before the game was released, with many noting the lack of just about anything that made the first game Bloodlines. Missing clans, a lack of side quests, a more linear narrative, hell, basically a gutting of the RPG systems that were included in the first game. This game does not feel like a sequel to Bloodlines at all. It's also not helped by the fact that it has very minimal reference to any of the characters from the original game, or even really any of the themes, political intrigue, or complex narratives from that game. It's not debatable that this project does not feel like a sequel to Bloodlines at all, and it shouldn't have been called Bloodlines 2. Even the co-founder of the Chinese Room, Dan Pinchbeck, was actively trying to get them to change the name of the game while it was in development. But that's where my agreement with the current discourse begins and ends. I've seen so many people say that Bloodlines 2 would be a great game if it wasn't called Bloodlines 2, and in my opinion, that just isn't true at all. There are so many issues with this game that don't come from its lack of systems and characters. The story is incredibly poorly paced. Bloodlines 2 feels like a 10-hour game stretched out to 15. The combat, while interesting at times, can be frustrating and clunky. The game performs incredibly poor on modern systems, and the side quests that are present are laughably bad. They would be considered uninspired fetch quests even in the worst of MMOs. That doesn't mean that there aren't things that the game does right. In particular, the art design and the environments are beautiful. Most of the character models are gorgeous and tend to properly evoke personality from just a glance, despite the game's drawn-out conversations. And though it took some time getting used to, Seattle's quiet, snow-covered streets generated an atmosphere that I really enjoyed. The small crunch of boots on powder and tender whistles of wind whipping at your back. But when I found myself walking around this city, I never felt like I wanted to stay. It wasn't because of poor environmental design or art direction repelling me from being in this place, but that I could feel how hollow this city truly was. Passing by shops with extravagant signs that I knew I wanted to enter, but I just couldn't. Having a conversation with a character 5 hours into the game and hoping that maybe now would be the moment when I would get to make a choice that might send me down a different path, but I knew that wasn't coming. And ripping the heads off of a group of Anarch ghouls for the 15th time in a row, just to get a bundle of experience points that I knew I wasn't going to use. It all felt pointless. Bloodlines 2 will always be haunted by the specter of the masterpiece that is Bloodlines. But the game that's underneath there, the one that isn't titled Bloodlines, the one that's marketed as a spin-off in the Vampire the Masquerade universe, is not perfect either. And Bloodlines 2 will also be haunted by the specter of the game it was supposed to be. The game that was promised but that never was. The one that brought back the original lead narrative designer and that tried to craft a true RPG in this universe once again. So that's what I'm here to talk about today. I'll be taking a look at Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2, diving deep into story mechanics, gameplay, and every missed opportunity in between. If you haven't seen my previous video on the first Bloodlines, I would highly recommend checking it out, as that game has a pretty thorough lore primer that will be useful to your understanding of this one. If you enjoy the video and want to support the channel, you can do so for free by liking the video and subscribing, as it really helps me out. If you want to support further, you can head over to my Patreon that's in the description below, where I upload video game adaptation movie reviews and monthly media reports where I talk about all of the media I consumed for that month. Spoilers ahead. Hey Dad, it's me, your favorite son, and today I'd like to talk about Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2. With the unsuccessful release of Bloodlines, publishers weren't exactly jumping at the bit to make another game in the world of darkness, especially Vampire the Masquerade. VTM itself would go through some trouble over the next few years, and White Wolf Publishing was actually sold to CCP Games in November of 2006. CCP was originally founded around creating MMORPGs, notoriously developing EVE Online. They bought White Wolf for the same reason, to hopefully craft an MMO out of the World of Darkness. This obviously didn't pan out though, and in 2015, Paradox Interactive acquired the rights to the World of Darkness and all of White Wolf's intellectual property. For the next few years, fans would speculate about a Bloodlines revival, and in 2017, CEO of Paradox Interactive, Frederick Wester, stated that they were aware people wanted a sequel to Bloodlines and that they would get one when the time was right. Fans wouldn't have to wait too long after this interview because in 2019, Bloodlines 2 was announced. Developer Hardsuit Labs had pitched Paradox pretty fervently to create a sequel to Bloodlines. They involved Brian Mitsoda from the start, the lead narrative director on the original game. Paradox was happy with their pitch and brought them in to craft the next entry in this world. Hardsuit Labs had really only worked on shooters at this point though, so it would be an uphill climb to create an ambitious first-person RPG, but they were ready to take on that challenge. Mitsoda, while reclaiming his role as narrative lead on the sequel, would also really serve as the liaison to the press as well. He would appear on many streams and do interviews to talk about the game and its development. From the public's perspective, this was fantastic. Mitsoda gave the sequel a sort of credit that I don't think anyone was expecting from the game. Announcing a sequel to a beloved cult classic 15 years after the original's release, and with new developers and publishers, is always going to be a red flag. But having the lead narrative designer back, the person responsible for the game's biggest strength, its writing, was something that sold the game to the fans who were still on the fence. And when journalists got their hands on the previews, things seemed to be trending in the right direction. The first half hour of the game saw you playing a newly created kindred, a thin blood that was turned as a part of a mass siring event. Before you could be judged and given your final death though, the court was firebombed and your character escaped into the night. The game had RPG elements like the first, though pared down a bit to make more sense and leave a few useless traits off of the character sheet. The game was set in Seattle, and its factions were meant to juxtapose the cultural Seattle with the corporate tech business takeover that was currently happening in the real-life city. Cultural and political warfare all in one battleground. Your character was meant to have a background that would affect your contacts and options that you would have in the game, and in the satirical Bloodlines style, the default background for a human in Seattle was a barista. Bloodlines 2, at this time, looked like it was shaping up to be a success. Maybe the game would release too early and be just as buggy as the first entry, and maybe it wouldn't quite fill every expectation, but the spirit seemed to be there. But we would never truly know because this version of the game never actually released. In August of 2020, it was announced that Brian Mitsoda and Kai Clooney, the creative director on the game, were both fired from Hardsuit Labs. Suddenly and swiftly, that fan sentiment was completely driven away. In a statement that he released, Mitsoda described the firing as a shock. This wasn't just a bad decision because Mitsoda lent the game credibility it needed to be marketable to a skeptical audience, but it also meant that there were no returning members from Troika Games working on the sequel. On top of this, Mitsoda had revealed he had been doing press and PR for Bloodlines 2 only because he believed in the game. The interviews made him incredibly uncomfortable and triggered his social anxiety, but because he made the game more marketable, they wanted him out there selling the product. Regardless, this version of the game was dead after Hardsuit Labs was removed from the project entirely. The public assumed the game delayed indefinitely, and we wouldn't hear anything about it for a few years. Behind the scenes, Paradox had chosen to shift the game to a new developer, the Chinese Room. This was an odd decision because even though Hardsuit Labs weren't known for their experience on ambitious and dynamic RPGs, the Chinese Room were mostly known for making walking simulators with very light mechanics. In 2023, it was announced that they would now be developing Bloodlines 2. The game that we would actually get, though, seems nothing like the game that we saw back in 2019. It's hard to say what parts of Hardsuit Labs' Bloodlines 2 were retooled and what parts of it were gutted. The factions that the team originally outlined, the Pioneers, the Camarilla, the Baron, the Newcomers, and the Unseen, seem to be totally missing, though some character models are present in the game. Lou Grand from the Camarilla looks strikingly similar to Lou Graham, and Prince Cross looks quite a lot like Prince Campbell. Locations from the 2019 version of the game, like Atrium and the Player's Haven, seem to have transferred over, so it seems like the Chinese Room were at least trying to reuse a lot of the assets from that game, but the story is almost entirely different from what I can tell. Regardless, the Chinese Room essentially made their own thing, and the game we got is unrecognizable from the game that Hardsuit Labs was trying to craft. Why this decision was made, why Paradox decided to choose a different developer, why Hardsuit Labs fired Mitsoda, are all things that we'll probably never know for certain. But what we do know is that it wasn't the end for Bloodline 2's development troubles. The Chinese Room's version of the game was initially set for a fall 2024 release date, which was pushed back to the first half of 2025 to add more endings to the game, allowing it to be a more personal story. The game was then further delayed in March to October 2025, where the game that seemed destined to rest in development hell would be allowed the freedom of unlife. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 was released for PlayStation 5, Windows, and Xbox Series X and S on October 21st, 2025. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines takes place in the World of Darkness universe. The World of Darkness is the universe that many tabletop role-playing games take place in, namely Vampire the Masquerade, but a few others like Werewolf the Apocalypse and Hunter the Reckoning. I talked about the tabletop role-playing game and its lore quite a bit in my previous video on the first game, so if you'd like a lore primer, go check that video out. I'm not going to retread a ton of ground here, but it is important that we talk about the role-playing game at least a bit, because something that I didn't mention before is that while the original version of Bloodlines 2 was being developed, so was the 5th edition of Vampire the Masquerade. The tabletop version of the game began in 1991 with the first edition of the game. After a second, revised, and 20th anniversary editions were released, the rights to the series were sold to Paradox, and they were looking to create a new version to capture a larger tabletop audience. Some of the development of 5th edition was informed by the development on Bloodlines 2. Mitsoda says, for example, that Resonances, an idea he had for the game, was then taken and put into the tabletop game, which you can now find in 5th edition. But 5th edition was a big shakeup for the world of Vampire the Masquerade. A lot of the clans were modernized, things were changed, lore was revamped a bit, and it's something we need to address when talking about the game, because Bloodlines 2 wasn't based off of the revised or 2nd edition of Vampire the Masquerade like the original game was, it was based on 5th edition. So essentially, the basics are still the same, and everything that I talked about in my last video mostly still applies. Vampires are allegedly descended from Cain, the antediluvians are seemingly still slumbering away in torpor, and the worldwide jihad is still controlling larger events around the globe, assumingly being controlled by elder vampires from afar. The masquerade is still in effect, meaning that vampires can't openly feed, and they aren't allowed to tell anyone about vampires, or they will be punished by the Camarilla with death. And there are still many clans at play, a lot of which have been changed a bit for the 5th edition. In total, 5th edition has 14 clans, technically. There are also clan pages for the Caitiff and the Thin Bloods, two groups that are defined by their lack of clan affinity. Clans in Vampire the Masquerade are sort of your vampiric bloodline. The clan that your sire, the person that turns you into a vampire, is a part of, is the clan that you will become, theoretically. But if you're of the 14th generation of vampires, meaning 14 steps removed from Cain, then you will be a thin blood, meaning that you will have less of a physical connection to the kindred and will seemingly have no signs of the clan that you were sired from. The Caitiff are similar, either abandoned from their clan or just not showing any sign of it because their bloodline has become weakened this far down. But the other 14 clans make up the bulk of what we'll see, play, and interact with in Bloodlines 2. There are the Bruja, brash rebels that either strive to bring the system down or to move towards progressiveness and ambition. As they infiltrate or instigate revolutions, their hunger and passion ensure that blood will flow, innocents die, and peace will never be attained. The Gangrel are a clan more rooted in animalism. They are outcasts and wanderers, sunk deep into tradition and initiation. They can be adventurers, storytellers, jaded from spending a life behind bars and yearning for the wilderness. They generally look and act more like animals than humans, a different showcase of the beast that's yearning to claw out from inside every vampire. The Malkavians are the clan of the insane. They generally choose to create Malkavians from humans who have a connection to the spirit world, people who can interpret dreams, perceive spirits, or have some sort of second sight. As a rule, no other kindred feels completely comfortable around a known Malkavian, often viewing them as unpredictable maniacs whose flashes of insight are rarely worth the fits of insanity. Malkavians claim to now be connected through something they call the Cobweb or the Madness Network, a mental connection not available to other kindred. The Nosferatu are malformed and disfigured upon their unlife. They look grotesque and often can't appear in society for risk of betraying the masquerade. While the Nosferatu and Bloodlines in the older editions were hackers, the Nosferatu now are more generally keepers of information. They archive knowledge and history that might not be available to the public. This has to do with the current information state, the advancement of technology, and some large groups inside and outside of the government that have caught on to vampire society. Because of this, the kindred are generally encouraged to keep their business offline for fear of the wrong eyes catching it. The Toreador are still artists and appreciators of the creative mediums, though there seems to be less of a focus on the ironic fact from Revised that vampires can't create anything new. I'm not entirely sure if that was removed or just omitted. Maybe somebody in the comments can let me know. But again, Toreadors are about passion, vanity, pomp, and circumstance. They say the first diva finally died in front of their looking glass, unable to tear their gaze away from the image of their face touched by the reflected dawn. The Tremere specialize in blood magic, as their clan was not sired into kindred society by ancient vampires descended from Cain, but they are said to have willed their way into unlife through ancient sorcerers and rituals. But a large thing that happened with 5th edition was the destruction of some of the largest chantries in the Tremere society. Tremere have special chantries that act as havens or strongholds in different cities. They also serve as places for new kindred to learn and be instructed in the Tremere ways. With the destruction of their biggest chantries, the Tremere have lost their clan structure, which was a defining characteristic of their group. A lot of the large power at the top of their pyramid has been lost. The Ventru are essentially a classic clan and very similar to their design in previous editions. They are business people, high class, corporate directors, or politicians. They scheme and politic, but they also hold a lot of power in the Camarilla. These are basically the standard clans that we talked about in the previous video, and all of these were playable in the original Bloodlines. But 2 clans have been changed quite a bit. Originally named the Assamites, the Banu Hakim have been rehauled. Once Middle Eastern assassins, the Banu Hakim are now more focused on justice and order, a group that prides themselves on their morality. They take out those who they believe deserve it. Most important to the discerning sire is a potential child who has the vision to realize the need for order and the means to build something that deserves to stand forever. But there's more to their philosophy than dragging random authoritarians under the veil of night. The La Sombra has been changed a bit as well, because since the last time we saw them, they have been accepted into the Camarilla, most of them anyways, and are no longer a part of the Sabbat, a cult group of vampires that don't recognize the Camarilla or the Masquerade. The La Sombra are ruthless, plotting in the shadows, and the core rulebook paints them as a sort of worm-tongue-like clan, people that have the ears of those powerful in the spotlight and use their influence to shift politics behind the scenes. They favor ambition and excellence over all else. There's also the Hakata, the Ministry, who were previously known as the Followers of Set, the Ravnos, Salubri, and the Zamisi. But none of these clans are really present in Bloodlines 2, so I'll be foregoing discussions on them for now. All of these clans make up Bloodlines 2, but which clans can you actually play? In the first game, you had the option between Brujah, Gangrel, Malkavian, Nosferatu, Toreador, Tremere, and Ventru. 7 total clans. In Bloodlines 2, you can play Brujah, Banu Hakim, La Sombra, Toreador, Tremere, and Ventrue. Malkavian, Nosferatu, and Gangrel have all been replaced by Banu Hakim and Lasombra. Talking about the clans, we should probably talk about Bloodline 2's gameplay, since you are properly primed on the lore. There will be some more relevant lore changes that we'll get into later, but for now, let's see how the game actually plays. Despite being a sequel to Bloodlines, this game shares little similarity with its predecessor in terms of mechanics and gameplay style. Instead of playing a character that we craft at the beginning, we play an elder called the Nomad. The Nomad wakes up branded with a strange sigil on his hand, and after seeing a poster for a rock band on the way out of a ruined apartment building, coins himself Fire with a PH. The sigil, though, dampens the Elder's powers, and thus he is limited in what he can do. Since we are playing a previously established character, we can't actually craft our character. There are no RPG elements to be found here whatsoever. Where the original Bloodlines had a robust character sheet with a variety of skills that would determine what you could or couldn't do in the world, what you could or couldn't say, Bloodlines 2 really only has powers. The powers that you can use are determined by your clan, sort of. Near the beginning of the game, you're allowed to choose what clan you're a part of. This determines the 4 active abilities that you will have and the 1 passive ability that you'll have. These abilities are unlocked using experience points that you get for completing quests and taking out goons in combat. But here's the kicker. Because you're an elder, for some reason, you can access every clan's powers by drinking the blood of one of their clan. So you can actually gain any power that you want to in the game, you just have to talk to the clan representative, bring them a certain amount of resonance, and then pay the experience points to unlock the ability. I absolutely hate this system, but we'll get to why after we talk about the powers. The general gameplay and combat of Bloodlines 2 is that of a first-person melee game, mostly. There are no weapons or inventory in the game. You can pick up things like pipes or guns with your telekinesis and throw objects or fire weapons at enemies. In fact, it's an integral part of combat, and you'll absolutely need to do it later in the game. But mostly you're going to be melee attacking enemies, a light attack and a heavy attack, and using powers to fight them. There's also a dash that can be used to dodge attacks, and if you dash toward an enemy as they land their attack, you will parry them. You can also feed during combat. This helps you regenerate health just like in the first game, except now we don't use a blood pool to cast disciplines. Our health is separate from our casting abilities. This is a change that was made in the 5th edition of the tabletop game as well. The problem with feeding is that it is slower than just outright killing someone. When you get an enemy's health down to 0, you can either do a sort of glory kill, a gory finishing move to end their life, or you can feed on them. Feeding is a bit slower, but both options are terrible, because while you're doing this, you're still able to be damaged. So you're stuck watching this animation play out while your health bar whittles down. And just hope that you actually gain more health than you lose during the feeding process, because sometimes you can just straight up die while feeding. It feels terrible and just makes the combat system feel needlessly frenetic. But the bulk of combat is made up of your powers and which ones you choose. The Banu Hakim are assassins and thrive in the shadows. The Brujas abilities all favor the fast and forward approach, attacking enemies head on. The Lasombra abilities favor the shadows, but not exactly stalking like the Banu Hakim, more literally using shadows to attack. The Toreador uses seduction as their biggest weapon, and their abilities reflect that. The Tremere generally use blood sorcery to attack their enemies. And the final clan, Ventrue, are more used to manipulation than anything, so they use these skills to their advantage in combat. No matter what clan you pick at the beginning of the game, all of these skills, aside from the passives, are available to you. The Mastery perk, though, is only available if you manage to unlock all of the skills for that specific clan. I'd also just like to note here that Bloodlines 2 was originally going to charge extra for access to the Toreador and La Sombra clans. This obviously didn't go over very well, and they changed this idea before launch, but it's kind of insane that they even considered this. There's one large reason that I hate this system though, and with just about every criticism I'm going to make, I'll first try to criticize the system or story decision through the lens of this game being a sequel to Bloodlines, but then also make sure I criticize that decision without that narrative attached. I think it's important to have context, and I've only really seen people criticizing this game because it doesn't deserve to be called Bloodlines, without realizing that this game has a whole host of problems detached from that moniker. This system, as a sequel to Bloodlines, removes almost everything that I loved about the first game. It's not an RPG, first of all. There are no skills, there are no checks in combat, we can't improve our combat ability, we can't even use skills in conversations, there's no intimidation or seduction or persuasion. You might be able to make choices in conversation, which we'll talk about more when it comes to story, but you are not crafting a character, you are playing a narrative that is essentially already laid out for you. And combat can be incredibly clunky and odd. Sure, the first game's combat system was not fleshed out at all. Even now, it's still a bit weird and finicky, but that system at least had progression. You felt yourself getting stronger every time you put a point into melee or every time you got a new weapon. In Bloodlines 2, there is essentially no progression at all. This is because we can only equip 4 skills at a time, so all of those abilities that you can unlock are fine, but you can only use 4 of them in combat. You can equip as many mastery perks as you want, but this requires a ton of grinding to be able to unlock all of the skills in one playthrough. Every time you want to unlock a skill from a clan representative, you have to spend resonance. This resonance is achieved by feeding on mortals who are out walking the streets. There are 3 types of resonance. Choleric, which comes from a mortal feeling a great amount of rage, generally when they're getting angry at an ATM machine. There's melancholic, when a mortal is feeling particularly depressed, which generally comes from them trying to break into a car, I believe. I assume this is meant to reflect their state in life, that they've gotten to a place where they have to commit crime, I don't know. And the third is sanguine, which is essentially when a mortal feels great lust. These resonances can be changed when you talk to someone. We have a mode in the game, which is essentially a Witcher's sense, which allows us to see blood trails, footprints, and the resonance of any mortal walking on the street. Some mortals have undefined blood resonances, and we can talk to them and change them. I believe that your ability to change these gets narrowed in over time, so if you spend much of the game feeding on sanguine resonances, you're only going to be able to get lust out of a person after a while. The same goes for choleric and melancholic, but there will always be resonance events that spawn on the map. You can feed on these people, which gives you 100 resonance points per feed. You need a certain amount of all 3 to unlock any of the clan's abilities, and of course, they're themed around the clan's specific attributes. Getting these resonances is so time-consuming. It's incredibly grindy, just repeating the same things over and over again. None of this is like Bloodlines, and removing all of the character creation and essentially game mechanics from the first game is one thing, but this system has basically no progression whatsoever. You get given your clan skills pretty early on in the game. About an hour or 2 into the story, you have your passive, all 4 abilities, and your perk. That's when you can start unlocking other clan skills and mixing and matching the 4 that you want to go with. The problem here is that every clan, if you choose to play with them from the beginning, has access to these skills a few hours into the game. Thus, you never really feel like you're leveling up. You don't ever feel like you're getting stronger. Sure, you can switch out some abilities and try something else, but the new ability you get from the La Sombra clan rep is the ability that you would have had 40 minutes into the game if you started as La Sombra. This means that combat becomes incredibly tedious, with essentially no upgrades throughout the course of the game. You can, of course, try to grind out all the abilities and unlock the perks, because you can equip all clan perks at once since they're passive, but this is a huge grind, and after I got 2, I decided to give up because it would have just taken so long. The perks themselves, even if you have all of them, aren't going to make you feel that much stronger. Part of the thing that makes the game feel so tedious by the end is the fact that you're essentially locked in with combat from the beginning, and aside from fighting different enemies and getting consumables, things never really change. I talked briefly about feeding on mortals in public. If you want blood resonance, the best way to go about it is to probably lead a mortal into an alleyway where no one can see you and then feed on them. This is because, much like the first game, the Masquerade is still in effect. But the Masquerade has been so neutered in this entry that it essentially means nothing. In the first game, you had Masquerade points. Break the Masquerade by feeding on someone in public, and you would lose one of your Masquerade points. Use a discipline that other people can perceive in public, and you lose another Masquerade point. Lose all your points, and you are given your final death by the Camarilla. There is a permanence to losing a point. You've done something wrong, and you either need to fix it or be more careful next time. You don't have the freedom that you did before. In Bloodlines 2, the Masquerade is essentially a wanted meter from Grand Theft Auto. If you break the Masquerade slightly by double jumping or climbing up a building, someone might notice and a green bar on the top of your screen appears. Break it even further by continuing these actions, and it turns yellow. Break it even further than that, and it turns red. This is when police just start swarming to your location and shooting you. If the bar becomes full when red, then you are immediately assassinated by the Camarilla. But no matter what color the bar is, even red, you can literally just hide on a rooftop or behind a dumpster, wait for it to go down, and you're good, baby. There is essentially no penalty for breaking the Masquerade in this game. I only had my Masquerade bar hit its max twice in my entire playthrough, and that was because by the end of the game, I just started openly feeding on the mortals to get the blood resonance because I didn't feel like leading them into an alley for the 100th time. And most of the time, I could just run away from the police afterwards and scale a building to quickly get away. You might make the point here that the first game had feeding as well, and that you had to also bring mortals into dark alleys to feed on them. But the first game had consequences if you didn't, and also, feeding on mortals all the time wasn't necessary. Sure, you needed to do it in between missions to get some blood back, but you could also feed on animals to do that or use blood packs. The only way to get resonance, outside of some asinine side quests that we'll talk about in a bit, are feeding on these specific mortals. The other big point I want to make here about Bloodlines 2 before we move on to the story is about the clues and notes that you receive throughout the game. I don't know how much money Bloodlines 2 costs to make. I'm sure when you factor in the lost development time on the original version, it's quite a lot. But Bloodlines 2 feels like an incredibly cheap game for $60. In the world, you can inspect items, which are often found in the environment. You're notified when you're near these because the cursor in the center of your screen grows the closer you get to them. This can lead you to consumables that you can pick up, signs that you can pull off walls to get extra XP, other side quest collectibles, but often this will lead you to notes or items that you can inspect in the environment. These notes or items don't even have their own separate window. I know this might seem like a nitpick, but it really just pissed me off. Instead of having a small window pop up where you can read the note or look at the box that you found in an abandoned building with a text description beneath it, the game takes you into this subscreen on the main menu. Outside of maybe 10 items that are inspected for the main story, none of these have images or inspectable models. They're just these cheap-looking text descriptions tucked away inside of a submenu underneath a ton of other submenus. These are god-awful and rarely ever consequential to the main plot, or hell, even the world. These notes that you pick up are all shoved in together under a separate menu within all the other menus, like the tutorials and advanced techniques. It's just so incredibly lazy and messy. This could have easily been separated into its own menu or tab. It also would have been pretty simple to create generic note models to appear here. The player doesn't have to be able to move it, but at least some sort of visual aid to spice things up. Also, if you're towards the end of the game and you want to find one of these again for reference, well, good luck, because they're just organized in the order you found them, and there's hundreds throughout this whole game, half of which are just talking about like shipment logistics for some fucking company that has no bearing on what you're doing. Speaking of, the UI itself in this game is just awful. It's not just that the menu looks cheap, the whole thing does. There are actually side quests in this game, believe it or not, and there's literally no quest page. There's no page where we can see a description of what we're tasked with doing. That's just relegated to the icons on the minimap. And again, this all just screams lazy to me. It would have been very simple to develop a screen with a list of your current quests. It's not that much more effort. And I just want to be clear that we have no way of knowing, but I would imagine a lot of this comes down to publisher pressure. I assume that Paradox wanted this game out as fast as possible once it changed hands. The game had been in development for years at that point, and they seemingly only carried over some art assets and level designs. Maybe these were creative choices, and if so, they're incredibly bad choices. But I have to assume that the publishers wanted to see a return at some point and didn't want to spend extra time on small things like note models or quest pages, as insane as that sounds to say. Despite all my complaints, I can actually give one bit of praise to the gameplay. The traversal in Bloodlines 2 feels very good. As an elder vampire, Fire can actually glide around a bit. We can also do a vampire run, which is super speedy, but if seen, both of these will break the masquerade, not like it matters that much anyways. Fire can also scale the sides of buildings for a short burst, but if we have something to grab onto, like fire escapes or air conditioning units, then we can run all the way to the roof. And jumping across the tops of buildings does feel really good. It's actually an improvement over Bloodlines, because the places where vampires would probably frequent would be the places where no one was trying to go, like the roofs of the local dive bars and shops. This would almost definitely be a valid method of travel for any kindred. It can be a bit clunky at times, like with this little timing minigame you have to play with the fire escapes, but it's overall fun. That is, until the second half of the game, when all the rooftops are flooded with enemies and it becomes a lot less fun, but we'll get there in due time. Regardless, most of the systems in this game are not successful. There are other things that we can do and interact with, and a lot of the systems and intricacies in combat come from enemy variety and the story, which is also where the game has its biggest troubles and biggest successes. So let's talk about it. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 begins with a short narration about Seattle, some small backstory here on the different monikers that the city has taken over the years. This sets up the theme that the place can change. Its environments may look different, but underneath the hood, it's all the same. It also sets up the change that's about to occur in the city as the Elder Fire awakens in a rundown building.
This town's had a queen for a long, long time. When the weight of a crown gets too heavy, people start sharpening axes. But it takes one hell of a push to set them swinging.
A security guard finds his body and we immediately drain his blood. We take out another guard and make our way through the structure before realizing that the narrator we heard before is in Fire's head, and he has a strange mark on his hand that he doesn't recognize. The man inside of Fire's head is a Malkavian detective named Fabian. We don't yet quite know how he got there or really who he is, but we'll learn all of that soon enough. And the sigil on Fire's hand is currently holding him back from using all of his powers. There were many developer diaries and interviews where the team talked about their decision to make the player character into an established person. They list many reasons that they wanted the story to feel immersive, allowing them to go deeper into the customization, to give the audience personal player choice, but I honestly just think they were saying things because none of that is exhibited over a created blank slate character. Fire's sigil is also, in my opinion, one of the weakest narrative decisions made in the game. A bland trope that's used to neuter the character's abilities so that they're actually playable in a video game that's meant to have challenge. You wouldn't have to do that if you would have made the character, I don't know, a freshly turned kindred or even a thin blood. Just saying. We learn that Fire was in torpor until recently, but he doesn't remember being awoken, and Fabian doesn't know the mark on his hand, only that someone is trying to control him. Neither of them know much at this point, only that this is our main story hook. We have to get to the bottom of the mark on Fire's hand and why Fabian is inside of his head. As we make our way through the apartment building, we see police cars outside. We have to maneuver through the building, avoiding the officers and sneaking around. You'd be remiss in thinking that stealth ever really actually applies again, outside of initiating combat encounters, because this is basically it. On the way, a radio broadcast notifies us that a Christmas storm is worsening, and the city is covered in a thick winter haze. This is a justification for the lack of traffic in the city streets. They've been shut down due to the inclement weather. We eventually come into contact with some ghouls in the building, seemingly planning to take out the cops arriving here. In the interest of keeping the masquerade, we have to take them out. These are our first combat encounters, and once we reach the roof, we can see over the city as Fire realizes he's awake in 2024 and he's been asleep for over 100 years. The two wake up in our haven, an apartment of an old friend of Fabian's, the room that will serve as our resting place in between missions. Fabian realizes here that he remembers Fire. He's heard tale of a kindred elder called the Nomad. The story of the Nomad isn't really written. There are legends, but no one knows for sure. We can answer here, determining the type of nomad that we are, and that will supposedly influence the way that people, or at least Fabian, sees us moving forward. Most of the game's cutscenes and story are played out through dialogue between Fire and the other characters, just like in the first game. We generally have 4 options when talking to other people. Sometimes these options are decisions, meaning we can only say one of them, notated by a small arrow to the left of the text. Other times, these options are exploratory questions, asking for extra information about certain people or events. Saying certain things to people will please them, offend them, upset them, etc. It is essentially this game's blank will remember that. And I'll just spoil it now that all of these characters will remember that, but essentially not until the end of the game, at least in any sort of meaningful way. The things you say, barring you making a certain choice in the game's third act, will affect the ending that you get. I believe it can also affect the way that certain characters treat you throughout the game. One of the developer diaries goes in depth into the choice-based story system that they had developed. They talk about how certain characters will box you into a particular role, and if you act outside of that role, they might act surprised, and contextually, they might have different responses for you. It seems very minuscule, and I'm not too sure if this still is in the game, because the only place I saw it referenced was in this developer post, but even if it is, it's honestly an imperceptible difference. And like I talked about with Bloodlines 1, the important part of role-playing and making decisions isn't necessarily that characters say different things, but that you view the things they say through a different lens because of the choices that you make. It's honestly more important for choices to have an effect on your vision of the character and story than the story itself. Luckily, Bloodlines 2 has neither, so we don't have to worry about that. Unfortunately, it's a bit harder to roleplay a character when they're already established, another reason that the Elder Kindred player character doesn't work. But Fabian gives us a very small, very rudimentary rundown on the world, but once again, it's from the perspective of someone talking to an elder. I have some more to say about how the world introduces the player to Vampire the Masquerade, but I'll get to that shortly. We're allowed to choose our clan here, and we have our first proper main story quest, where we have to follow Fabian's scent to figure out where his body has gone. On the way downstairs, we can hear the greatly inferior Det of Night, Seattle's version of Deb of Night, but I appreciate them at least putting this in the game.
Meet some other boss babes. Each one you send my way gives you a little bit something extra in your wallet.
Sure. Sign me up, hun.
Hunting the scent down will lead us to a rooftop. We don't find Fabian's body there, but that of an eviscerated Thin Blood. It seems that someone has been on a rampage, slaughtering Thin Bloods across the city. That someone turns out to be Benny Muldoon, the sheriff of Seattle. The sheriff generally works for the prince, enforcing their law around their domain, but Benny has something different to say.
Fuck the Camarilla. Fuck the prince.
He has basically shirked the Camarilla entirely and is trying to root out every Thin Blood in the city. He has no trust for the Nomad, though, and says that he has only one night to handle his business before Benny will take him out. Regardless, we end up following Fabian's trail further, leading to Katsumi's bar, the leader of the Anarchs. We fight some Anarchs inside and outside, similar to the ghouls that we took out earlier. You're right, it is pretty odd that the Anarch faction is our enemy in a sequel to Bloodlines. Don't worry, we'll get there. Fabian's scent is eventually traced back to a warehouse where we find the detective's body, face entirely torn apart. Fabian has a flashback of waking a sleeping fire from his coffin, and since the Nomad was in torpor, he had no control over his faculties. The beast took over and he attacked what was closest, assumingly committing diablerie and accidentally taking in Fabian's consciousness. Fabian tells us that we need to talk to the prince to activate the tradition of the hospitality, to show ourselves to the prince and get permission to walk in his city. But despite not having any of his memories, Fabian has a feeling that it's a bad idea to go to the prince, so he tells us to head and speak with Lou Graham. Lou was previously prince of the city, but she stepped down of her own accord and allowed Campbell to take over. So we can head to the Glacier Hotel, where Lou keeps her home. When we take the elevator up, though, Fabian has a flashback. A memory courses through his head from 100 years ago. It's the first time he arrived at the court when Lou was still the prince, with her sister Rosalind. He is introduced by his sire, Gideon, and as he tries to explain his usefulness to the court, we're sent back to the present day in the Glacier Hotel once again. The Glacier Hotel, where it was once full of court activity, is now empty and quiet. There are bodies strewn across the apartment, and a trail of blood leads to the main room where Lou Graham is stationed by herself. Fabian politely reminds us before we start the conversation that our statements will have consequences here. Depending on what we say, Lou's opinion of us will change, and it's probably the first real conversation in the game that is going to determine what people think of us. We can introduce ourselves to Lou and ask her about the current situation in Seattle. Apparently, Prince Campbell was murdered very recently. His head was removed from his body and he was placed in the local park. No one knows who killed him yet, but his death has also come with a spree of murders around the city, a case in which, again, the culprit is not known. On top of that, Lou has been attacked by the Anarchs tonight, and with the recent tensions between the Camarilla and the rebels, she is pointing the finger at them. Prince Campbell was Lou's child, meaning she gave him the embrace, turning him into a vampire. Since his death, her other child, Ryong Choi, has taken over Seattle in his stead. Whether the Anarchs did it or not, they are taking advantage of the power vacuum and running rampant all over the city. At the end of the day, though, Lou doesn't know anything about our brand, and Fabian has instructed us that maybe it's not a great idea that we tell anyone about his presence because it might bring us some trouble. We can head to Weaver Tower next to introduce ourselves to the current prince, Ryong Choi. On the way out of the glacier, we meet Isabella, a Toreador artist in the city that runs the Atrium nightclub. She has taken an interest in fire and invites us to her domain. When we get to Weaver Tower, we find the place swarming with Anarchs, and of course we have to take them out to get inside. We quickly meet Tali, a Nosferatu that worked for the court under Campbell, but that is now in the employ of Ryong. He reinforces the messy situation the Camarilla is in right now. Since the prince was killed, the city has been a wreck, and they're still trying to figure out who did it in the first place. Also, the only reason that the tower has been invaded by the Anarchs is because Benny, the sheriff we met on the way here, just up and left his post.
It's been a regular good old-fashioned nightmare since Campbell went down.
We can further scale the tower to find Sophia, a science gal that Tali told us about.
But, wait. You... No. Surely... Forgive me. You're the Nomad.
She is a very anxious and awkward Tremere, also in the employ of Prince Ryong. She is very surprised to see fire, as she is well aware of the legend of the Nomad and is somewhat fangirling out that she gets to meet him. She asks to speak to us later, but we can now finally head to meet the new prince. Ryong is interrogating an Anarch in her office, but since she's getting no information, she decides to off them. We introduce ourselves to her, and Sophia introduces the idea that someone has tried to frame the Anarchs for Prince Campbell's murder. And on top of that, Tali brings an issue to the prince. Last night, when the Nomad was in his frenzied state, he left a trail of bodies behind, breaching the masquerade. We can apologize for this, but Ryong is also told about the attack at Lou's, and apparently Graham wants some answers. Right now, almost none of this has to do with us because we introduced ourselves to the prince and we're allowed to leave. So we head back to our haven to rest, and suddenly we're in a dream world filled with sunshine and a large field of flowers. A path through leads to a massive tree, but we're actually playing Fabian here, and fire is inside of his head. Fabian hears a strange voice narrating this dream.
It is the truth seeker. Will you not wake?
But just as quickly as it arrived, it is gone, and we're back in another one of Fabian's flashbacks. This is sort of the structure that the game will carry moving forward. We will do a few quests as Fire in the present, then we'll go to bed, have a dream as Fabian, and flashback to a few days before he ended up inside Fire's head. During these flashbacks, we'll also sometimes double flashback to the 20s time period that we saw at the Glacier Hotel. Now, I just have to say that while I do enjoy some things about the story, I'm not going to lie and say that nothing hits. The pacing is just completely off. It honestly feels like 3 stories wrapped into one. These flashback segments, while they can be interesting, are just far too long. Or honestly, maybe the present day segments are just way too long, but it feels like something should be taking the back seat here, because we just spent almost 2 hours with the main character and Fabian. We're introduced to the world, we're told that Fire is an older kindred named the Nomad, we're given a few narrative leads. First of all, who is Fabian and how did he really end up in Fire's head, who killed Prince Campbell, and who put the mark that is inhibiting Fire's powers onto him. But that's really it. And then we're going to jump to Fabian's story for about 30 minutes and abandon that for a bit, because Fabian's stories, until the end of the game, are mostly entirely separate from what's going on with Fire. It starts to connect about halfway through the game, but the narrative isn't that great at keeping you engaged. It just feels like it's flopping around for quite a while. The first flashback sequence is probably the shortest because it's only about a half hour, but sometimes these sequences run 2 hours or so. I don't mind the concept in general, and it is ambitious, it's just executed poorly. And this whole game in general could have had 2 to 5 hours shaved off of it, and it would honestly be better for it. But Fabian's sections bring a pretty big gameplay change as well. First of all, we don't fight as Fabian at all. He doesn't have any combat sequences. And being that he's a Malkavian, he has completely different powers than Fire. These powers are not customizable. We have a set few, and that's what we're left with. They all generally allow him to do something investigative, since he's a detective after all. Fabian can look inside of people's heads and see what they're hiding from him. He can make them forget about their conversation so he can have a little retry. He can make himself appear as someone they're expecting, though we often have to figure out who that is during conversation. And he can also speak to inanimate objects to learn the secrets that they're hiding. A lot of these powers would be cool if we were allowed any freedom with them, but most of the time Fabian's segments are so on rails that we just have to figure out which one we're supposed to use. We're not allowed to really fail either, because if we're supposed to appear as someone else and we have something specific to say, even outing ourselves as Fabian, we just use the power again and try a different option until we get it right. The power that lets us talk to inanimate objects is also kind of unclear. Fabian isn't really talking to the objects, he's just sort of intuiting things that he already knows. In the case of a cell phone or a tape recorder, he's just listening to the messages or looking at what's in the phone, I believe, because the items can't really tell him anything he doesn't already know. Even the first time we use this on a murder victim's body, we're told as much.
You call me Lord Fabian.
I'm a construct of your psyche, remember? Do you really want to stroke your ego that much?
So I guess this is really just an interesting way for us to interface with the information, but it also brings us to Fabian's character. Fabian is a Malkavian. He's one of a very few Malkavians in the game, and if you remember, we can't choose to play a Malkavian player character. I assume this choice was made because it would be too expensive to do what the first game did and create an entirely unique experience for one clan. But then, hey, maybe don't make a game called Bloodlines 2 then. Regardless, I think Fabian was chosen to be a Malkavian so that they could technically say that you play a Malkavian in the game, no matter what clan choice you make. Because while Fabian is a little quirky, He is very far removed from the straight up insane and second sight gifted individual that we play in Bloodlines 1. Hell, he's pretty damn different than even the Vorman sisters. Most of the time, he just comes off like a normal guy. He has very bad memory issues, and a lot of the flashbacks are him recalling the things that he forgot. But these memory issues don't come from his Malkavian lineage, but from a story development that we'll get into later. There are some fan theories out there that Fabian is actually crazy and he's misremembering some of this, but the game doesn't really make that clear if that's the case, and honestly paints Fabian as a hero at the end of the day. So fan theory or not, this isn't the conclusion that the game explicitly comes to. Sure, you can say that this is just the team's interpretation of a Malkavian, but in that case, it's kind of a bad interpretation of the clan. I did also find some articles from before the game switched hands to the Chinese room, where the team spoke about wanting to be more careful about how mental illness was represented in the game, essentially saying that Bloodlines was a bit dated in its methods of handling this issue, which I think is an honest pursuit. But you can even look at LA by Night, the official canonical Paradox actual play series. The Vormans show up in that, and they are interpreted in the same way that Bloodlines interprets them. And even an original character named X, a Malkavian that is very clearly a Malkavian. Maybe the team didn't want a crazy, wacky voice in your head for the entire game, but then maybe it was a bad story hook to have another character's voice in your head for the entire game in the first place. So in Fabian's flashback, he's in his office at the police station. He was a sort of man on the inside, looking into strange cases and generally attempting to cover up and get info on things that the Kindred may not have wanted the wider world to be aware of. He's not that great at it though, because everyone kind of looks at him like a crazy person. Officer Wheeler has a message from Fabian's boss, who at this point is Benny Muldoon, the sheriff of the Camarilla. We can find a strange man here in the holding cells who is incomprehensibly drunk. We'll learn later that he's not actually drunk, but we can't understand anything he's saying, and he also isn't able to tell us his name, so no one can get him home. We can head outside, but as a sort of tutorial, Officer Wheeler doesn't want to let Fabian leave, so we have to use our Malkavian powers on him to make him forget about the money we owe him. We can then head over to the Macomb bar, where the owner, Fletcher, is having some trouble. A girl was sent here on behalf of her sire, but she's not a kindred, she's mortal. Fletcher thinks it might be a risk to the masquerade. The woman's name is Pandora, and she isn't that willing to give up information. Using our powers, we can find out that her sire wanted her to deliver the message, "Beware the sword of the cross." Telling Fletcher about this will send us to Patrick, the bodyguard, at the door. He gives up that Pandora was dropped off in a limo. Fletcher kind of wants the girl dealt with at this point, but when we go back to check on her, she is impaled on multiple pieces of rebar. We can talk to her body to find out her head was ripped off, and that she's now wearing a strange cross-sword artifact around her neck. Beware the sword of the cross. She then says this,
Would you kill, detective, for a cigarette?
Which causes a flashback to the 20s, where Fabian is investigating another murder in the Macomb bar. Same style, rebar, and everything. This time, it was a cigarette girl that was killed. We can talk to Campbell nearby, who at this point in time is just a ghoul in the service of Lou Graham. He hasn't quite ascended to Prince or even full kindred status yet. Out in the bar proper, we can talk to Gideon and Hector, Gideon being Fabian's sire and Hector being the current sheriff at this time. We can learn that the murdered girl was a ghoul of Rosalind's. Rosalind was Lou Graham's sister, and they ruled over Seattle together, 2 princes, which was an uncommon occurrence. Talking to Fletcher, who found the body, reveals that the killer can't be kindred because they committed the murder while the sun was up. Giving this information to Hector, he directs Fabian to cover things up with the police department, and we're awake again in present-day Seattle as Fire. We now have to meet the prince at the Macomb bar. This is another gripe that I have with the structure of Bloodlines 2. It constantly introduces environments in the flashbacks and then makes us re-experience them, often 2 more times in different time periods. It's a good idea, but it's never really taken to its full potential. The idea that we could see different environments or people and watch them change over time would be cool if it was used well, but it's often not, and the lack of environments in this game just really starts to show itself. It feels more like a way to reuse assets rather than get the most out of them. Speaking of, there's really only around 10 buildings in the game that we can regularly visit, most that only have one NPC that's interactable. The rest of the environments that we'll use are one-offs for missions, usually combat dungeons, but there's also only maybe 5 of those. It's not a huge critique if the game isn't around 15 hours, but that runtime gets you really used to these relatively small places. Regardless, we head to the Macomb bar. The prince has decided that she wants us to hunt down the ex-sheriff, Benny Muldoon, and bring him back to her. Out back, we can find a thin blood he killed and track his scent. This leads us to an anarch that saw him, and fire straight up just drops him from the roof. He tells us that they found his auto shop. We can head to Muldoon Auto Repair and sneak inside. We find Max hiding out here. Max is actually Benny's sire, despite looking a lot younger than our crazed sheriff. It's very clear that Max is covering for his child. He's scared of what could happen to Benny if he's caught. Benny and the prince were clashing over their differences in opinion about how to deal with the Thin Bloods. Campbell enjoyed a tenuous relationship with them, and Benny thought he was too soft. Once Campbell was killed, it was free reign for Benny to go all out on the Thin Bloods. Max eventually realizes that Benny needs to be stopped and tells Fire that he's hiding out at the Weston Rock construction site. As Fire leaves, Max notices the mark and shows him a ring that he found with the same sigil. Heading to the construction site, we find a large presence of Anarch ghouls. Tracking him inside, we can find a very interesting note from Nines Rodriguez. Apparently he was sending lost sheep or Thin Bloods to Katsumi to deal with. Katsumi is the leader of the Anarchs, and we'll meet her shortly. Fighting through more crowds of Anarch goons, we find Benny stuck inside of a large block of cement with a stake in his chest. As much as I dislike this game, I have to say that this is a super cool way to disable a vampire, and also the purple light in this scene is gorgeous. Hey, I never said it didn't look good. Benny is immediately pissed off, and something comes over him as he breaks free from the concrete. We have our first boss fight here. Boss fights in Bloodlines 2 are essentially all the same. Some of them have very slight mechanical differences, but essentially each boss has 3 health bars. Getting one down then requires you to feed on them to start the next phase. And they all share the similarity that after every time we remove one of these bars, the boss summons more goons to help them fight us. In Benny's case, more Anarchs are invading and actually fighting him as well, which is a neat little unique dynamic. As we grab Benny, Katsumi, the leader of Seattle's Anarchs, is introduced to us. She's pretty pissed that Benny has been killing Thin Bloods and that we've been killing Anarchs, but she's willing to forgive all this if we hand over Benny to her. We have a choice here, one that will have an impact on the end of the game, but that won't really have an impact on the here and now. We either give Benny over to Katsumi or we take him back to the prince. Regardless of our decision, Benny's fate will rarely be referenced for the rest of the game, and he just sort of disappears from the story. I don't even know if they actually tell you if he dies. It's very strange. Part of the hole in the story here is probably because the Chinese room had already announced 2 DLCs for Bloodlines at the time of release. One called Loose Cannon, meant to show its head in June 2026, where you play as the sheriff himself, and I'm assuming fill in the plot holes associated with his story, and another called The Flower and the Flame, where you play as Isabella and do the same with her narrative lacking. Regardless, on my first playthrough as a Toreador Fire, I decided to take Benny back to the prince. I sort of roleplayed this character as trying to please those in power, speaking nice to Lou Graham and the prince, offering up my services where I could, sort of the good playthrough, if you will. We'll talk more about Katsumi and the Anarchs in a bit. I have a pretty big complaint with this game that I'd like to call the Katsumi problem, so wonder about what that means for the next 20 minutes or so. Bringing Benny back to the prince, Ryong makes us the new sheriff of Seattle. This is meant as a gift. We're allowed to freely roam the city, access the court, and investigate the mark that appeared on our hand. This is also where the idea of clan representatives are introduced, so we can meet all of them shortly. Ryong asks for our assessment on Katsumi. Tali asks us to check in on Lou since she was recently attacked, and Sophia wants us to meet her at the local bookstore. So now we have some threads to follow, and we can also start the worst part of the entire game, the side quests. There are 2 types of quests in the game. One type I'll call collectible quests, and the other type I'll call quest chains. There are 3 total collectible quests. One from Fletcher, where he wants you to find 30 graffiti marks all over the city that look almost identical to the fire marks you can pull with telekinesis to get XP. Another from Silky, the Brujah clan representative, who wants us to remove CCTV cameras around the city. Essentially the same exact thing, just pull them down with telekinesis. And a third from Patience, the Toreador clan representative who is working on an art piece and needs 9 sword cross things. These quests aren't really even quests. They're just meant to give you some experience and something else to fill this world, because without these things, Seattle would be entirely empty. Hell, it still is entirely empty. I guess if I'm giving them some credit, then they do tell you a little bit about the characters. Fletcher is a Ventru, worried about the sanctity of the city and its beauty preserved, so he wants the graffiti removed. Patience is a dorky little art freak and she wants to create a masterpiece, and Silky is a classic Brujah. He wants to rally against the system and return his community to privacy. The other type of quest, the chains, are somehow even worse though. There are 3 types of these as well. Mrs. Thorne's quests, the Tremere representative, Onda's quest, the La Sombra representative, and Nico's quests, the Banu Hakim representative. Onda's quests are literally just go to an area and kill some goons. Nothing special. We kill the same enemy types all the time in the main quest. Maybe there is one slightly stronger enemy, but it isn't even a boss or anything. We also get about 2 sentences to contextualize the narrative around each quest. There's nothing of substance here.
Izzy's an older ghoul among the Anarchs. Got big ideas. She set up a den on top of the Goddard building. Can you deal with her?
I will deal with it.
The same goes for Nico's quests. Nico runs a pawn shop and the items that he receives all have backstories. For him, some of these people are unsavory enough to warrant murder, and he sends us out on assassination tasks. Again, every single one is the same. Track a person down, kill them, head back to Nico. Oh, and for your troubles, you get a potion. Great. Mrs. Thorne's quests are easily the worst though. She literally has you delivering and picking up packages for her. What are these packages? Who knows? The game doesn't tell us. There's some very simple information listed in the codex when you pick them up, but it's honestly not even worth looking at. Would have been another good opportunity to include an in-game model here, but whatever. At the end of each of these quest lines, you get a one-off quest, which kind of introduces a little bit of nuance to the whole thing, but it's not worth it at all. In Nico's quest, he sends you to kill Officer Wheeler, who took a bribe, causing a colleague to die. You sort of have this moment where you have to choose between Fabian, who knew Officer Wheeler in the past, or Nico, who sent you on the job. But it just feels pointless that the game requires you to do 10 quests across the entire course of the game with very little meaning to get one single 1mm kernel of substance underneath. Mrs. Thorne's quests end when you have to deliver a package to a mystery man and it seems like she might be doing something bad, but who knows? These quests are such a far cry from Bloodlines. The Thin Blood side quest that accurately introduced you to the wider world of the game. The Pisha side quest that had you tracking down artifacts for a centuries-old vampire. The VV quest that sends you looking for a guy that's writing a script about the Kindred. These are all so damn good. And they not only properly contextualize the world, but they offer more substance to the game, interesting encounters, and unique characters. Most of the clan contacts are fleshed out a little bit through their conversations, but I feel like I know more about somebody like Fat Larry than I do Mrs. Thorne. This brings me to another point about Bloodlines 2 and how it introduces the player to the world. If you watched my first video on Bloodlines, I talked a lot about how good it is at bringing the player into the world of darkness, how it sort of throws you in without a life raft, and then slowly, over time, uses your lack of knowledge and experience to motivate you to seek out extra information. On top of that, it gives you many opportunities to learn more through the world and the characters. This is a feedback loop, because as you learn more about the world, you learn more about the characters, so on and so forth. There's a flow to the game and the way that it delivers information. None of that is present here whatsoever. I'd be interested to know what someone who has only played Bloodlines 2 and hasn't looked into anything at all knows about the world of Vampire the Masquerade, because not only does it feel like the game doesn't really try to bring you up to speed, it almost feels like it assumes you know everything already. Or if it does explain concepts, then it explains the updated versions of those concepts because it's someone talking to an elder vampire. Take the way that Fabian talks about the Masquerade to Fire.
The world's a lot smaller now than it was. Getting smaller too. How big it must have been back then.
The first game didn't have this issue because, well, you were a freshly turned kindred, new to the world of vampires. People needed to explain things to you so you knew what was going on. It doesn't really make sense to explain how feeding works to an elder. Because of this decision to make the main character an elder, you lose a lot of that wonder, that lust for the world that Bloodlines so often bred. Bloodlines 1 felt like a story or multiple stories, but also a world within those stories and attached to them. Bloodlines 2 just feels like a story. I have to imagine that these side quests were just some sort of afterthought that wasn't really planned for this version of the game, but only put in because they knew people would be upset if a sequel to Bloodlines didn't have side quests. Back to the main story, we can head over to Luz. She tells us about an arrangement that she has with the court. They provide her with mortals that she can feed on, specific ones that satisfy her tastes. Since the attack, she has had no one to seek out these meals for her, and so the court sent a replacement. Her replacement isn't working out though, so we need to help her. Before we can do this, Lou enters some sort of trance, her eyes glow red, and she starts chanting incomprehensible phrases. Lou doesn't say much about this if asked, and we can head to meet Nyx downstairs. Nyx is the gangrel tasked with hunting down Lou's food. Lou doesn't like Nyx because she's certainly a little odd.
I'm sure we'll be best buds. Want to sleep over at my place and we can braid each other's hair?
Nyx isn't used to vampire politics or society, and she certainly has no idea why Lou has specific tastes for rich mortals, so she isn't doing good work. We can head out and mark some individuals for Lou and help Nyx get a better idea of the scent that Lou is looking for. After this, we can meet Sophia at the Wake the Dead cafe. Earlier, I praised the art design in this game, and that definitely still stands across the board, but I also further want to praise whoever made the posters, signs, logos, and just all of the graphic design around the city. It looks gorgeous. The ads for Atrium on the side of buildings, the radio station that Dead of Night broadcasts out of, even the Wake the Dead sign. Too bad we're not allowed to enter most of these buildings because they're pretty inviting. At Wake the Dead, Sophia is once again fangirling out over the Nomad. She still has a task for us though. The Anarchs have taken some hostages, specifically Sophia's ghouls. They are her assistants at Weaver Tower and will help her with her research if we get them back. So we can head and rescue 3 of the ghouls by defeating some Anarchs. Heading back to Sophia though, she tells us we missed one named Piotr. He had already died by the time we had arrived, and she is upset about this. Sophia definitely also has a thing for fire.
I have never been good at loss. Will you stay with me? Talk to me? Distract me, perhaps?
Finally, we can meet with Katsumi at her bar called The Hole in the Wall. She talks about the current situation with the Thin Bloods. Throughout the country, they're just generally straight up killed. But in Seattle, things were different under Campbell. That trust has degraded with his death. But now, Katsumi has some masquerade breakers in her ranks, and she needs us to take them out. So we have to take out a few groups of anarchs across the city in a certain amount of time, specifically before they do something that would break the masquerade. So you've probably already asked yourself this, but why have we really only fought Anarchs thus far in the game? Well, this is simply because the Anarchs that we met in Bloodlines don't necessarily represent the state of the Anarchs throughout the country. Plus, Los Angeles was a special case. It was an Anarch-free state, meaning that the Camarilla wasn't even that present until LaCroix showed up. This is not the case for the rest of the world, and especially not for Seattle. In Seattle, the Anarchs are fractured, and many characters, specifically Sophia, tell us this. It's confusing, and the game even recognizes that fact. I don't have a problem with this. The situation is nuanced, and that's okay. But the game never really tries to explain this. It just recognizes that it has created a confusing plot device and then glosses over it. It's confusing to play a sequel to a game where the Anarchs were like sort of the good guys, and you had to really look hard from a different perspective to see how they might be bad, and now we're just only killing Anarchs for the first few hours of the game. We're only looking at them as enemies. That's confusing, and it would be a lot less confusing if the game properly presented the Anarchs as two splintered factions with separate motivations. What if the Anarchs were going through a mini sort of civil war after Campbell's death, and Katsumi was leading the people that wanted to try and find a way forward, and the other faction was just ready for revolt? This faction would have its own leader and character that we could speak with and get to know. Hell, maybe part of the main narrative is choosing one of these two sides and helping them to take out the other, or getting them to agree to come to terms and work together. The game doesn't really tell us who the fractured Anarchs are. They tell us why they've fractured, but it's essentially another way for them to just have a faceless mob of goons that we could take down. And there are a lot more factions in Vampire the Masquerade that they could have used to do this. Like, I don't know, the Sabbat? But we'll get to them later, though. One of the places that we end up when helping with Katsumi's Masquerade breach issue is back at Benny's auto repair. The Anarchs were attacking the place because they want repayment for what Benny did to them, and Max is the closest available thing. We can influence Max here because he needs some guidance. We tell him to head to Katsumi and work to right the wrongs that his child did. After one night of sheriff duties complete, we can head back to the Haven and take another nap. We're back in the field as Fabian again, with the mysterious voice speaking its tongues. We then snap back to Fabian in the not quite present, investigating the more recent rebar murders. A woman named Verona is in his office asking him to look into the person that is sending her death threats. She found the threat in her purse along with one of the sword crosses that appears at the rebar murder crime scenes. We can Malkavian investigate the death threat note to find out that it was given to her in a bar. Questioning Verona, we can find out that she went to the Dutchman, Glacier Hotel, and the Macomb bar last night. We can talk to Benny about the rebar killings from the 20s. In this time period, they apparently solved the murder, placing the blame on a vampire hunter named Santiago, but they never caught him. Fabian thinks that the killer is back, or that it's at least a copycat. Silky won't tell us whether Verona was at his bar, and the Glacier says that they kicked her out because she was being disruptive. And at the Macomb, Verona puked on the doorman's jacket before even getting inside. At some point, we also have to try and tell Campbell about Fabian's theory on the rebar killer, but Ryong refuses to let us inside. So we can finally head to the hole in the wall and talk to the bartender. Someone was staring strangely at Verona and her group of friends. We can talk to the pool table and track the guy back to a small hideout in the Weston Ruck construction site. We can find out that the person that gave Verona the death threat was a ghoul. This information causes Silky to give us some more information about the girl, that she had pawned something. We can then head to Nico's pawn shop to find that Verona pawned a locket, but the name she gave wasn't Verona, it was Ravenna. We can head back to the station to question Verona, and there's a pretty funny sequence here where we can tell Verona about all of the terrible things she did last night, like get kicked out of the Glacier and get blacklisted from the Macomb. Verona eventually reveals that the locket belonged to her sister named Ravenna. They are twins, but they don't speak to each other anymore. Fabian believes that the death threat was meant for Ravenna and not Verona. She tells us that her sister works at Atrium, and we can head over there and convince Isabella to let us talk to her. Once we get upstairs, though, Ravenna is already dead, hoisted up on rebar. We learn that Ravenna was a blood doll for Isabella, but we're no closer to finding a killer, especially since now the murderer is doing his work at night, and it's been 100 years since his first kills. We then get a flashback to the 20s once again, to a time when Fabian is being grilled by Rosalind. She's trying to impart the concept onto him that there are two princes in this city, and that he must listen to both. The gist that we'll get from this flashback and the previous one that we experienced is that Fabian's presence is generally unwanted. This is something that the game does get right about Malkavians. It goes back to that quote about most kindred feeling uncomfortable around them. It doesn't help that he's a detective either, that he's constantly snooping around in other people's business. Lou tells Fabian she has something to speak with him about, but we're supposed to mingle first. Rosalind tells us that she and her sister are investigating a joint enterprise which they call the Carstairs matter. We can speak with Hector, who tells us to keep our eyes out for anyone suspicious, to get to know people and try to get to leads so that we can stop trouble before it happens. Hector, as the sheriff, was working with Fabian even when he was a new kindred. The big names here are Fletcher, who at this time was running booze for the court during Prohibition, Isaac, who was the Nosferatu secret keeper for the administration, and Gideon, Fabian's sire, who runs the gambling in the city. Hector is the first one to introduce Fabian to the idea that the rebar killer is Santiago, a famous mortal hunter who has lots of kindred blood on his hands. Isaac, though not talkative, will tell us about Santiago, primarily that all he knows is all of his killings feature the Cross of St. James. We can learn more about Fabian's new relationship to Sophia, another newer kindred who, along with Gideon, is interested in puzzles. Gideon will also give us info about Hector, though, that he's hiding something. This turns out to be about a woman that Hector has been seeing. Finally, talking to Lou, she will propose that Fabian looks into some people in law enforcement that are blocking their attempts at selling booze. Before she can give us any more details, though, a crash comes from the next room. Venturing inside, we can learn why Rosalind isn't around anymore. The rebar killer got her back in the 20s. We're then back in the present once again as Fire. He and Fabian are both trying to figure out exactly why these memories are being uncovered and what relevance they have. We meet Tolly in the lobby of the apartment building and he has a task for us. Apparently Isabella's nightclub, Atrium, has been locked to the public, and there is blood on the snow outside. We have to investigate and find a way in. Once we do, the building is being attacked by ghouls, but not the Anarch ghouls that we saw before, strange enemies referred to as marked ghouls. They also happen to have the same symbol as fire on them. Through the building, we can find television screens relaying a message from Isabella about her art.
Is mine, and I give this heart to you, my people. So jump, Teshin, jump, and emerge as poetry of the blood.
We can find a strange recording to Isabella on a tape and a blood doll off in a separate room. Her name is Verona, the same Verona that Fabian interviewed in the past. She's gotten wrapped up into the same thing that her sister was. It almost seems like she's in a cult with the way she talks about Isabella's work. We can solve a very simple puzzle to get into the next room where we have to fight blood dolls that seem to be overcome with some sort of spell. We actually move through rooms of these people that are just pulsing along with the music, entranced and in nearly comatose state, which I'll admit is a really good visual. Fighting through some more of them, we come face to face with Isabella. Because of the marked ghouls here, Fire thinks that Isabella had something to do with marking him, but she only tells him what we know, that it was designed to constrain and control. She does have something to do with it. We are apparently a part of her art, but she certainly isn't the main one behind the mark. Isabella plans to shirk the masquerade to show her blood-fueled work, and through her words, Fire realizes she must be a part of the Sabbat. We then, of course, have a boss fight with her where she summons more of her blood dolls in between getting rid of health bars. Fire tries to ask Isabella about the mark before she dies, but she tries to entrance him, and he is forced to kill her before getting any answers. Back at Weaver Tower, we can give Ryong the bad news about Isabella, but she and Tolly don't exactly believe Fire's theories about the Sabbat. Ryong still wants us to look into it though, but Tolly is completely against this line of reasoning. On the way out, he talks to us once again, telling Fire that someone might have information on his mark. The court keeps all of their secrets inside of the head of a Nosferatu secret keeper named Willem. We might be able to track him down and get some answers. Heading to Willem's Haven, though, we find the place invaded by Anarchs. We have to destroy them so we can get to a small storage container that hides the entrance. Here we have to solve a small telekinesis puzzle, pulling 3 switches before they return to their starting place. Willem isn't in his haven, but some notes reference his previous family and the Wake the Dead cafe, so he might be there. Sophia is there, apparently also looking for Willem. Apparently he can't hunt, so she brings him blood regularly, but he's gone missing. She guides us to the plastic factory though, thinking he could be there. Heading there, we find more marked ghouls, but luckily they haven't breached the place. Willem is alone inside, but gets very cagey when we start to ask him questions. He seems to be involved with the mark as well, but he's being controlled by someone. Willem screams in Fire's face, and we're moved to the front of the factory. We fight through more ghouls, but it all seems to be an illusion created by Willem. Finding Willem, we're moved again, but this time forced to fight mannequins. After defeating them, we're transported one more time and then allowed to explore an area with gramophones that hold Willem's memories. They all tie back to his family, and Willem wanting to see them again, but being kept from his old life by the new kindred visage that he's taken on. It seems this motivation was eventually used when someone came calling. When we get out of this hallucination, Willem is strapped with a bomb and has a phone in his hand. He said he would be allowed to see his family again if he took away the court's secrets. Willem reveals the person that told him this, a Malkavian called the Gardener. Willem reveals also that he's been on a call with the people ordering him, and they set off the bomb. We're then back in the dream world as Fabian once again. This narrator, I guess, is revealed to be the gardener through subtitles and tells us that he needs a plan before once again jumping back into Fabian's memories as Campbell is asking for the same thing from Benny Muldoon. They need a way to get to the modern-day rebar killer. Fabian theorizes that he's being shown these memories for a reason, but Tolly interrupts. There's been another murder near Pioneer Square, and we're sent to go look into it. We can talk to Sophia before we leave, who basically has nothing to say other than offering Fabian some help. We can investigate a tape recorder in her office, though, to find some incomprehensible mumbo-jumbo. Heading to the fresh crime scene turns out to bring us to what would become Fire's haven in the present day. Before heading inside, we can talk to Reggie, a homeless man whose memories seem to have been blocked by someone. Inside the crime scene, the apartment owner, Dale, has been killed and impaled on rebar, just like the previous murders. Talking to him basically tells us the same thing we found from all the other murders. His head was removed and he was put up on some rebar. Fabian theorizes that it must have been a kindred, though, because his head was ripped off and the crime was committed at night. Dale was a ghoul, though, and someone was feeding him blood, so that could be a lead. We can talk to Sophia again, who theorizes that the killer is Santiago, again. We can give her a potion that we found at Dale's. She tells us to ask Mrs. Thorne, who might know what the potion was used for, and she tells us it was meant to enhance someone's memory. We can talk to a few people to see what they know. Nico can tell us about the Cross of St. James, which seems to be specifically made to look real, like a prop. Tolly doesn't tell us anything, but we can invade his mind to find out that Willem was looking for the memory potion and Dale was his ghoul. We can head to Willem's hideout and we have to solve the same puzzle we did earlier, except that Fabian doesn't have telekinesis. So the developers just put a telekinesis potion nearby, which is not a potion that shows up literally anywhere else in the game. It's just used for this one specific thing. Anyways, Willem reveals that he was using memory enhancement potions to keep his memory straight for the court secrets he was holding. Fabian doesn't suspect it was Willem, though, and we flash back to the 20s again. Hector is getting Fabian ready to interrogate a suspect in the rebar killings. We figure out that this flashback comes shortly after Isaac, the one who we met at the party in the 20s, has been killed. The court has lost its secret keeper in the past, just as it's lost its secret keeper in the present. Hector can also be questioned here about the girl that he's involved with. According to him, they're not together, though. Questioning the suspect, we realize it's actually Willem, pre-kindred. He's an accountant for Lou Graham at this time. He had been sent by Lou to give Isaac a package, but he was still alive when Willem left. I wouldn't consider Bloodlines 2 super funny. It makes a lot of attempts at humor, ones that often didn't land for me. But there is one very funny joke in this scene, and it plays out like a bit you'd see in Arrested Development.
Did you see anything?
No.
Right, and I was the Emperor of China. Right, and I'm the Emperor of China.
We can get in Willem's head to figure out that he was actually there to see Isaac so that he could be embraced. The killer came when he was there, but Willem didn't see him. He heard him breathing, though, so he must have been mortal. We're then brought back to the present day as Fire is being woken up in Weaver Tower. Tolly rescued us from the explosion. Sophia is distressed at Willem's death, but Fire fills them in on the details. He's convinced the Sabbat is behind all of this, behind Benny and Isabella and Willem. Sophia doesn't believe it, though. Ryong sends us out into the city to smooth things over. We can check in with Sophia, who apologizes for her outburst. She was angry that Willem's death left her alone. She finally has some information on the sign. She found old texts that reference it, but she needs to confirm that it was the Sabbat by finding an older text forbidden texts that were confiscated by Lou Graham herself, and she doesn't particularly like Sophia, so we have to ask her for them. We can ask Lou about the books and find that she started to enjoy her new hunter Nyx since we stepped in to help her. She also tells us that the books we're looking for are hidden beneath St. Stephen's Church. Before we can leave, Lou has another one of her visions, though. She once again says nothing of these visions out of embarrassment, and we head to the church to grab the books before running into some marked ghouls. We can then give the books to Sophia, who will take some time to study them. She warns us about Ryong because Sophia believes that she is really still under the control of her sire, Lou Graham. We can then head over to the Dutchman to meet Tolly. I'm going to be honest here. I'm kind of struggling even to get through writing what happens in this game. It's all in the interest of getting the plot details to the viewer, but if it's this bad, just going back through, then imagine what it's like playing the game. And listen, I'm giving you the short version of a lot of this stuff, but the pacing in this game is just so awful, I almost can't express it. Part of it has to do with what I already talked about, and it's that the story is split up between Fabian and Fire. And not that it all sort of intertwines between the two of them. I mean, it does once you get to the end of the game. In retrospect, it does. But that the story is sort of split between the two of them for most of this game. For a while, they feel so incredibly fragmented and disconnected. At the beginning of the game, we have basically one big story thread to follow, and that's the sign on the back of our hand. How did it get there? Who is trying to control us? We are halfway through the game and have barely scratched the surface of that answer, and barely even really dealt with the problem at all. We should be motivated by this. We should be moved by this. We should be propelled by this. But we're just essentially waiting for other people to do things, waiting for Sophia to research a book, waiting for Ryong to give us more orders. We are killing time for most of this game. Just to recap, without the Fabian interstitials, what we've done as Fire is wake up, find our body, rescue the prince in Weaver Tower, chase down Benny, fight Isabella, and get caught in the explosion with Willem. And we are halfway through the game. Outside of that, we've had to deal with some asinine tasks as our new duty as sheriff. Sure, some of these tie back into the main story, but some of them are just isolated and end up being a long, tedious mission that only serves as an introduction of a character trait, like finding the right food for Lou Graham. It certainly doesn't introduce the idea that she's picky or that she has control over the court. We've already been introduced to those concepts plenty, and we don't need a whole mission to understand what it would be like to be her lackey. Now, if this was an optional side mission, I wouldn't mind it as much. It would be an interesting extra piece of information with a unique side character to boot in that of Nyx. Nyx, by the way, is also not very important to the main story as she appears one more time and then fucking dies. So you can't say this beat is necessary for that. And something I haven't really talked about yet is that all of the conversations in this game are just so long. And this is coming from someone who does not usually complain about this stuff. I don't mind long sections of dialogue. My favorite video game series is Metal Gear Solid. I love JRPGs. Disco Elysium is one of the greatest video games of all time. Give me well-written dialogue and I don't mind if you have 20 hours of cutscenes and conversations, but characters are constantly either reiterating the same points they made before, or they're just inefficiently explaining something that could be conveyed in 20 less words. The game is not efficient with your time at all. Speaking of that, a lot of the game ends up being taken up by walking from one place to the other, back and forth across the city to talk to Sophia, to talk to Katsumi, to talk to Mrs. Thorne, to kill some enemies, to talk to Sophia again. And it honestly kind of takes the air out of the room when you walk all the way across Seattle as Fabian to investigate a lead, just for someone to say, I don't know, and maybe go talk to Nico? And then for Nico to give you a very unimportant, very minor piece of information. The whole game is just made up of the loosest plot threads possible. Like the whole thing makes sense, but boy, is it just a slog to get through. And the problem with Fabian's stories are once again that we spend so much time on them. We spend so much time investigating the rebar killer, of both present and past, when the player is told from the very first moments of the game to be interested in what's going on with fire. And the loose plot thread is constantly dangled in front of us that, someone must be showing us this for some reason, but they won't explain what that reason is until nearly the end of the game. So what is keeping you playing? Again, I don't mind the concept, but the game just executes this idea poorly. Alan Wake 2 juggled a similar sort of thing, two main characters back and forth the whole time. One we are already connected to because of the previous entry, and the other we're connected to through mechanic emphasis and story. This is why I say that Fabian's parts should have been shorter and more condensed. Anyways, Tolly is very upset that Willem died, mainly because they've lost many secrets with his life. So we have to seek out what's left, starting with a book of secrets Benny kept at the SPD. This is one of the worst missions in the entire game. Stealth up to this point has happened when mandatory exactly once. We can stealth to start combat whenever we want to take out enemies from behind, but this mission sees us just literally walking in the front door and then sort of sneaking around some boxes, but it's so easy to get spotted. It just feels like they didn't even try. We have to make our way downstairs and get a key to Fabian's office so we can use the ducts to get to Benny's. We can find a reference to Officer Chunk down here. Yay, references to things that I like. Upstairs, we find a book and a tape recorder that has another message from the deep-voiced man on it.
This destruction is not what we agreed. It is too early. Our prince may have fallen, but there is much left to do. I will be greatly displeased if you do not contact me.
It seems like he was the one controlling Benny, Willem, and Isabella. And here's the kicker. Fabian just says that I guess we can walk right out the front door. Yeah, we had to sneak in here because someone would notice, but walking out of the missing sheriff's office? No, that's not a big deal. Any civilian can do that, and no one will bat an eye. We can take this book back to Tolly and then go to meet with Katsumi. We find Max at the bar instead, now working with the Anarchs after taking our advice. He's here to deliver a tip from Katsumi that Verona made it out of Atrium alive. Since she was a blood doll, she's been asking people to bite her, which could get her in trouble. But once we get there, Silky says that she already left after she was refused bites in the bar. We can get her scent and track her down as she's already being attacked by some Anarchs. She's pretty upset that we killed Isabella and she wants someone else to feed on her, but she's basically addicted at this point and we can't let that continue. She says that Isabella and her crew were collecting the blood of all their kills and hoarding it. This only started when Campbell died. We can head back to the bar, but Katsumi is back from whatever business she needed to handle. She won't tell us where she was though. She, like Tolly, asks us of our opinion on the new Prince Ryong. After this, we can head back and rest at our haven. Once again, we're in Sunflower Dreamland and the gardener is speaking to us. We then flash back to another rebar killer murder scene. The victim wasn't anything special, meaning he wasn't a kindred of import, and Max has a similar memory block. He saw the victim, but he didn't get a good look at his face, just knew that he was big and mortal. The last thing Max saw, though, was a pregnant woman, and the officer on scene has CCTV footage of a woman with child. We can head back to the station to look at police reports about memory loss. There are 3 people that Fabian knows, and we can ask them if they've seen any pregnant women. After questioning all of them, we find the police reports once again to connect them to the same location, St. Stephen's Church. There we find Onda blocking the door. She knows about the pregnant woman and she's actually protecting her. She says that she's had terrible things done to her and she doesn't want Fabian to do the same. We can speak to her downstairs and it turns out she's a Malkavian, but like a traditional Malkavian, not like Fabian.
A man dreams, a man dies. The cops scrub the asphalt, scrub the cellar floor, and no one remembers. There are some things you can save without memory. Perhaps I saw him. Perhaps she did.
It turns out that Misty was embraced when she was pregnant, so in turn she'll never have birth. Her child will never age and never be born. She's worried that the father of her child wants to kill her, but Misty also saw a vampire at the murder site, even though Fabian believes that the killer is mortal. Misty then says that the court is hunting her and that Fabian said he would save her. This causes a flashback to the 20s once again, but Misty is bleeding out on the floor, right next to Hector's body, strung up on rebar. This was the girl that Hector was protecting in the past. He tried to save her, but it didn't work. He was trying to keep her hidden because the court would be interested in the child of a man named Johnny Campbell. He was a ghoul at this point, not a full kindred yet. As Misty fades off, about to die, Fabian embraces her. We then wake up once again as Fire, heading off to see Ryong at the Macomb bar. Ryong is happy to keep the details of Willem's death a secret because the public doesn't know them yet. But Ryong has decided to help in our investigation since Sophia has corroborated our theory that the Mark and the Gardener are related to the Sabbat. Ryong thinks we should head to the underground because local police have a lot of files about disappearances and deaths around the entrances to that place. The underground is the part of Seattle that remained after the Great Seattle Fire in the 1800s. This is a real event that happened in Seattle's history, but also a large part of the history of Seattle in Bloodlines 2. When the city was destroyed, people began to build over top of it, leaving ruins of the old city underneath. This is what the underground is today, and some of it is open for tourism, but most of the more dangerous parts are closed off. This is an idea that was clearly taken from the original version of Bloodlines 2 because that was in the original plan for the plot. Since we're on the topic, I'd like to talk about what Bloodlines 2 lacks from what we know about the original version of that game. Two large things in particular. The first thing is the overall theme of progress versus tradition. Mitsoda talked about this a couple times in interviews, how current day Seattle, at the time, was facing a lot of new economy because of tech companies and startups moving in, and there was a struggle for Seattle to keep what it had from the past. A lot of the story is about taking the real-world issues of Seattle, trying to keep its identity, but also changing that for the 21st century, and the conflict brought into the game between the factions representing that. Obviously, the Chinese room changed the game greatly. There are still slight remnants of that, with a new prince being at the behest of an old one, so on and so forth, but it's not really present as a narrative device or even really a conflict. By a certain point in the story, we'll see that Ryong, other than acting as a tipping point for the city, doesn't really serve any sort of larger purpose, and even just from her disposition throughout the game, we can tell that she doesn't really sort of lean any way. She's looking to her court and us to provide opinions on what to do next, which is a good role to have in a leader, but that's besides the point. The other thing that isn't really present from the original version of the game are the distinct factions that the game had planned to include. Short descriptions of the factions were included and released to some press outlets at the time the game was marketing. The Pioneers were led by Lou Grand and were made up of old money families, but their power had been disappearing in recent years. The Camarilla was another faction, one that benefited from the tech boom in their city, and were mostly made up of software moguls and CEOs. The Baron was the sort of face of the crime world in the underground, recruiting thin bloods, ghouls, and even humans to do anything he needed them to. The newcomers seemed to be a sort of Tremere faction, led by a man named Professor Victor Goga, and they were at direct odds with the Baron. And the Unseen were a faction full of Nosferatu journalists and hackers, hanging out in dingy places and trying to get their hands on secrets. Bloodlines 2 doesn't really have that many factions, and the ones that they do have are so blurred and ill-defined that you have to think hard to even really determine whether they are a faction or not. You have the Anarchs under Katsumi, but some of them are bad guys. Then you have these people being led by the Sabbat, or whoever is controlling them, and then essentially the Camarilla. But one thing that the sequel feels like it doesn't really have is community. It just has all these seemingly disconnected NPCs that just sit in their little buildings and wait for you to come along. The Anarchs in the first game felt like a group. The people in Hollywood all felt like a group. The Nosferatu felt like a group. Really, the only people that truly feel like a group in this game is the Camarilla, Tali, Sophia, and Ryong. And that's really just because they tend to appear in short cutscenes together. Ryong tells us to head to the underground with Nyx, the gangrel we met before. Lou isn't really happy with her though and wants her fired, but by the time we get there, Nyx is already dead. We make our way into the underground, following the claw marks leading away from Nyx's body. Deep in the remains of the old city, we meet a new and possibly the most annoying enemy in the entire game, the Unbirthed. These are Sabbat creatures of some sort, and they absolutely suck to fight. If combat wasn't already annoying enough, wait until you see how annoying it is when you can't feed on the enemies that you're fighting. Yeah, that's right, you can't get blood from the Unbirthed at all, and they rarely ever get stunned when attacking, so they just ram straight through your offense, doing quick damage. They absolutely suck, and I hated every time I had to fight them, which was a lot. I greatly dislike this game. We fight through a lot of the Unbirthed and eventually make our way through the underground, happening upon a group of the Second Inquisition fighting against the monsters. They are a new enemy type we're introduced here to as well, but far less annoying. You can tell your game has pacing issues if you fight the same two enemy types for the first 2/3 of the game. They are armed with anti-kindred weapons, a lot of which will stun us, but they mostly fight like the Anarchs or Marked that we've fought so far. Since the soldiers blew the entrance to the underground that we needed to get to, we can't get inside. Fabian decides that we should head back to the surface because we can't go further and someone will know another way in or something, I don't know. Tali tells us the soldiers are from the IAO, Information Acquisition Office. Tali warns us once again against our Sabbat theory and also warns us to not go into the underground. Eventually, after his protests, he sends us to Lou to find another entrance to the place. Lou isn't so easily swayed, but only gets interested when we mention the gardener. She says that he was a Malkavian that she thought was gone, and she finally admits to seeing her visions, realizing they might be because of the gardener. Once she realizes the severity of the situation, she allows us access into the underground through her basement. We can head downstairs and gain access to a larger part of the ruins, and even hear a rousing IAO speech from their mother hen.
We lost a lot of good people already. But remember your training. And remember what we fight for.
Reckon they met up with some of our nasty little underground buddies.
These things down here are monsters and should be exterminated on sight.
We eventually make it into a massive cavern and find a large study full of different books. I really thought there were going to be some interesting notes here because we can inspect some of the books, but a lot of them just say, a hardback copy of so-and-so edited by blank. It's heavily used. We find an odd hand here and have to find the fingers that have been removed. We have to find different sigils painted around the place that we can only see if positioned in the right spot. Returning all of the fingers to the hand transports us back to that tree, but this time it's not a dream and fire is in control. Now, this is easily my favorite part of the game from a story perspective, from a visual perspective. Everything here is great and super inspired. The gardener as a character looks so fucking good. Very Baron Harkonnen from Villeneuve's Dune. And I honestly think that with a bit of a different lead up and some narrative changes, this should have been the end of the game. This should have been the finale, and the gardener should have been the sort of final villain, so to speak. Unfortunately, the game continues on past this, but we'll talk about that in a bit. The gardener mostly speaks in riddles, but reveals that his purpose was to bring fire here. He wants to give his strength to fire. He wants him to feed on him, to commit diablerie. But fire, of course, refuses and kills the gardener. It's revealed that he's been stuck in rebar this whole time underground. We are then assaulted by more soldiers and have to escape the underground. Arriving back in Lou's quarters, Sophia and Ryong are already here. They are debating about the IAO and how to deal with them. They're currently attacking Vampire Havens out in the open. Lou, of course, wants us to remove the head of the organization to send a message. Sophia doesn't want us to do this because she thinks the response will be greater if we remove the head. But we essentially have three options of response here: to use the IAO to our benefit, to ignore the IAO, or to not underestimate them. This will be important for later because we will have to make a choice on this in a bit. We then have a private conversation with Lou. She is free of her visions now that the gardener is gone. Lou doesn't really reveal who the gardener was, just that he was someone who needed to be silenced. She also says she dealt with the Sabbat in 1889, or at least she thought she had. Fire still doesn't understand why his mark isn't gone now that the gardener is, and neither do we. We can then head back to the Haven and rest once again, and of course we end up in that field as Fabian, but no strange voice narrating this time. We then flash back to the 20s again, and Fabian is talking to Gideon. Fabian still can't stop the rebar killer, and the name has started to go public in the papers. Fabian still thinks it's a mortal hunter that's quite strong. Gideon asks if the killer has ever been seen. Does the killer even exist? Sophia joins the conversation, and they end up speaking of current events, specifically Rosalind's death and its effect on the court. Sophia is currently studying in the basement of the Glacier Hotel. Gideon then decides to take his leave to go speak with Lou. Fabian ends this flashback by saying that this night wasn't the last night they both saw him. And then as we wake up, the game just reveals to us through Fabian and Fire's dialogue that Gideon was the gardener.
There it was, all along. And I knew it. And I didn't know I knew.
Gideon was the gardener.
Oh yes, that is clear, isn't it? We never did find his body, but we did close the case.
I wasn't super invested at this point in the game, so I imagine if I was, that I probably would have caught it before this, but wouldn't there be a better way of revealing this than just straight up saying it to the player directly? Like, I didn't catch anything from the previous scene at all that directly says that Gideon is the gardener. Fabian is having trouble with his memories, though. He believes that he solved the case but can't remember. Lou has become suspect number 1 at this point, though, and Tolly is ready for us in the lobby. He's found the IAO headquarters. We're supposed to head there and take out their records on the Kindred, and Tolly advises us not to take out their leader, even though Lou wants us to. We next have to remove the IAO monitor points from around the city, taking out their eyes and ears. We can then head into their main base and have to destroy a few generators to open the large door at the entrance. Inside, there's a massive wave fight with a ton of enemies dropping in from the ceiling. On the way through the building, we find a lot of the IAO's notes on various kindred they were watching around town. Eventually, we make it to the central chamber where Mother Hen, Agent Baker, is waiting for us. She's very pragmatic and wants to make a deal with Fire. Her scent reveals that she's dying, with only a few weeks left. She wants to be turned into a kindred, I guess. The thing she gives us in return is information that Katsumi was meeting with a mystery person outside of the city. So we have 2 options here. Now, this is a pretty big choice for the game, and honestly will determine which ending you get. There is definitively a good choice and a bad choice here. Now, in my first playthrough, I thought, foolishly, that turning the head of the hunters into a kindred seemed like a terrible idea. That even though she said she would help, that she would turn on us immediately. Well, that's not true at all. You're really supposed to make this decision. If you kill her, then the entire IAO takes over the city and you get the bad ending to the game, even when you beat it. Now, what I hate about this decision is that there's no third option. Agent Baker is going to die in 6 weeks anyways. Why is there no option to just walk away? I mean, why have a conversation prior to this mission where we're introduced to these 3 options and then not give us that option later? It was the choice I wanted to make, but for some unknown reason, you're given a binary. Outside of the ending, this choice does have slight ramifications. If you kill her, then you obviously won't see her in the next mission, but if you don't, she'll briefly be present after this. Regardless, we can report to Ryong back at Weaver Tower. Since Katsumi's meeting is suspicious, the court wants us to look into it, thinking that Katsumi might be part of the Sabbat. We're to meet Ryong at the Macomb later, and then we're supposed to check in with Lou, but first we can go rest at the Haven. On the way there, we're stopped by an obviously flustered Sophia. She asks about the gardener, and Fire tells her what happened. Apparently, she has also found a match for the mark on our hand. Someone has bound him, which we already knew, and they're still out there, otherwise it would be gone, which we also already knew. Sophia says that she's getting close to figuring out how to break the spell, and we can meet her at Wake the Dead tomorrow when she has the solution. On the way to the Haven, Fabian wonders if it's Lou that's been doing the rebar killings this whole time. Resting once again brings us back to the field, with Fabian wondering about Lou and her connections to the killings. We jump back to the recent day when Fabian is telling Sophia about Lou's involvement in the killings. Sophia directs Fabian to the basement of the glacier where Lou supposedly keeps her trophies. We can't get inside without helping Tolly though, so we need to get him some information. We have to find secrets on Silky, Onda, and Patience. Turns out Silky has a werewolf friend outside of town. Patience is working on a strange art project with an interesting skull involved that she got from Katsumi, and Onda seems to have made a deal with the court to stay in Seattle. She was tasked with killing a priest for them, but didn't actually do it. She faked his death and let him leave. Of course, we don't have to tell Tali about this part, but getting all the secrets gets us inside the glacier. Downstairs, we eventually find Gideon's glasses, and Fabian has finally figured out where his old sire went. We can go give this information to Campbell at Weaver Tower. We tell him that Lou was the rebar killer, but he doesn't immediately believe it. Campbell reveals that Fabian has already brought this theory up before, and he wipes his mind, implying that this has happened many times in the past. We then jump back to the 20s where the same thing is happening with Lou. Fabian has figured out who the first rebar killer was. It was Campbell. Since he was a ghoul at the time, he could go out during the day, which explains the time of the killings and the strength of the killer. He was just doing the killings at the order of Lou Graham, taking down the people that were getting in their way. Lou then wipes his mind and we're back in the present day. They still don't know who is sending Fabian the memories or who marked fire. We're then sent to Lou's place to look for one last food source for her, a very specific and descriptive one that seems to match specifically that of Verona. We can talk to Verona and either send her Lou's way or tell her to avoid Lou Graham at all costs. We can go meet Sophia at Wake the Dead after this, but while waiting for her to show up, Fabian and Fire have a conversation where Fabian asks us if we'll stay in the city after this is all over. After waiting for a bit, we can talk to Mrs. Thorne, and she gives us a voice recorder left by Sophia. She has found the solution to the sign on our hand and tells us to meet her at the conservatory. When we get there, the place is crawling with marked and unbirthed. Making our way through the place, we reveal an underground lab where experiments were being done. We even find a note from Beckett telling whoever was there to be careful because they were playing with too much power. Fire remembers being here. This is where he was marked. We can find a large board with pictures of the kindred of Seattle, the ones that are gone marked with large red X's. We eventually find Sophia in the lab downstairs, a picture of herself on the body with a large red X. Fire feels responsible for her death and carries her body outside. Suddenly, we're back in Weaver Tower and Fire is explaining himself to the court. Lou shows up before we can leave, the first time she's left her hovel because she's come out of retirement. Lou literally does not care about Sophia's death at all because she fucking hated her. She also tries to blame her death on the Anarchs. She thinks Katsumi is leading the Sabbat. Ryong tries to push back, but Lou uses the influence on her and forces her to submit. We can try to refuse as well, but Lou tells us that if we don't comply, she'll launch a blood hunt on every Anarch in the city. At this point, we can head to meet Katsumi because someone needs to let her know that Lou has a target on her back. At the hole in the wall, though, Tali is here instead of the Anarch head. He basically tells us where Katsumi is because he knows that this Anarch war won't be good for anyone. We head to the jungle, a shanty town in the city. There we can find a ton of the Anarchs, and we'll see Max. We can direct him into being a leader for the Anarchs if we choose the right dialogue options. Then we cut through some more Anarchs and finally find Katsumi. She refuses to tell us who she's been meeting with, but says that she hasn't been working with the Sabbat. And regardless of our choices here, we are shot at by a mystery sniper, the person that Lou has been meeting with. We have a section where we have to fight off Anarchs while tracking down the shooter, and once we finally do, the big reveal hits. So, it's been a mystery for the second half of the game who Katsumi has been working with. And if you were paying attention to the press releases from before this game switched hands, or really paying attention closely to this game's development at all, you will already know that it's Damsel. Damsel, if you didn't know, was a part of the Anarch faction in the first game. She was boisterous, a bit aggressive, and certainly untrusting of anyone outside of her group. But if you treated the Anarchs well, then she would become a good ally. Damsel appears randomly at the end of the game, probably because the original Bloodlines 2 had already planned to include her character and had a model for her, and it is the most random, seemingly pointless inclusion that I could have possibly imagined. She keeps a shotgun aimed at our head the entire time and only gives us time for 2 questions. She eventually asks us our plan, which just sort of reflects the type of fire that we're playing and what we want at the end of the game. But she doesn't know anything about the mark. She basically tells us that we've been tricked, that Lou conned us into coming down here to protect the Anarchs, while something bad is probably happening in the city. So then Fire says he has to go, and then that's just done. Damsel is gone. So, whatever. Anyway, we head back to Weaver Tower for another big reveal. As we enter the main office, our mark flares up again and we are staked through the heart by Sophia. This is the other big, huge twist in the finale, that Sophia was playing us all along. Now, I'm not sure how much I can criticize this, because I saw this coming from a mile away. Maybe others didn't, and hey, then the twist worked. But man, they made such a big point of telling you that Sophia is a great person, that she's never done anything wrong, that she's awesome and everyone loves her, and she's always calling you my love, which I thought was odd. There's literally one specific scene early on where you're being told about the court, and they talk shit on Tolly, but then say that Sophia is just grand, and don't worry about her at all. No, don't look over there. Don't look.
Sophia's always been scatterbrained. Used to hang around with my sire. Maybe my bloodline rubs off on some. I like her, though. Reminds me of more innocent times. And we both love getting our fangs into a good puzzle.
Sophia. I apologize. She gets absorbed once she has a project.
Am I one such project?
I hope that's not a problem. I can see you two working closely together. But we'll discuss that when you've done the job.
And when Fabian is investigating her office, you find the tape recorder full of incomprehensible notes. I figured she was up to something. I really don't mind the fact that it was predictable. The story has way bigger issues than seeing what's coming. What I do mind is the fact that all of this just comes far too late. Or maybe it comes far too early. The game either needed to be a few hours shorter or a few hours longer. Regardless, Ryong is strapped to a chair here and given her final death as the sun rises. Sophia explains that she was Sabbat all along and that her goal was to bring her love, Gideon, back by giving him a new body to subsist in. I could nitpick here and say that this doesn't make much sense, like she could have just gotten Gideon's body out and then Zamisi surgeried him into looking better, but it's fine. I do like the Sabbat inclusion in this game, for the record. One of my very few complaints with the first game was that the Sabbat were never really addressed as much as everything else. We didn't get to see the complex parts of their culture like the TTRPG shows, because the tabletop game has a lot more complexity for the Sabbat, like the bloodbath rituals that we see Isabella preparing and such. So having that was actually nice. Credit where credit is due. Fire was meant to be a replacement for Gideon's body, and she faked her death in the lab to convince him she was gone. This is why Gideon tried to get us to feed on him in the fields, but now since he's gone, Sophia is looking for revenge and wants us to take Lou out. At this point, Fabian realizes the severity of the situation and tells Fire to jump out the window. The Elder goes to burn in the sunlight, but the Sabbat can't follow him out here. He crawls towards the darkness as his skin burns, and before we see his fate, we get a flashback to Fabian in the graveyard. He's speaking to a disembodied Gideon. He realizes that he needs a way to keep the knowledge that he has, the memories of what Lou and Campbell have done. He plans to record Campbell's confession and send it off to the Justicars so that they will bring him to justice, even if his mind is wiped again. So we had to grab Sophia's recording device, but when we hear the recordings, it doesn't really sound like Sophia. She's talking about the shipment of the Nomad's body and using language she wouldn't normally use. Fabian, of course, doesn't think anything of this at the time and tries to enter Campbell's office, but he isn't there. We can Malkavian spell Ryong to get into Campbell's office and look at his journal to reveal his location. His coded notebook shows us that he's going to meet Benny, Katsumi, and Tolly. Tolly doesn't give us anything, and Benny only says there's an arms deal going down tonight. Katsumi says she'll give us Campbell's location if we give her Dale's alchemy recipes. So we walk over, grab the recipes, bring them back to Katsumi. This is the end of the game, by the way. Like, last 30 minutes, we're fetching recipes. Katsumi found some shipment from some ghouls, and the Anarchs commandeered it. She gave the goods up to Campbell because she didn't know what it was, just that it was powerful stuff. Campbell is already at the warehouse, and when we get there, he's inspecting Fire's coffin. Fabian, while recording, tries to get a confession from Campbell, but he knows that Fabian is recording and forces him to smash the thing. He then also forces Fabian to use his powers to investigate the box to see what's inside. Campbell forces Fabian to tell him if the chest is safe to open though, and knowing that his death is close at hand, Fabian opens it and feeds Fire his blood, waking him up and causing his own death, but also causing Campbell's in the process. It seems that Fire was the one that killed Campbell in the end, but someone moved his body to a public place and staged it like a murder. We then have a flashback to the 20s, where Fabian is saying goodbye to Sophia after Gideon's disappearance. She wasn't happy with the detective and is actually kind of an asshole.
Goodbye, Sophia.
Goodbye, Fabian. I wish you were as good a detective as you think you are.
And then we're finally in the fields again. It seems that something to do with the sunlight has caused Fire and Fabian to split because both of them are here. Somehow this saved Fire, or he's just old enough to be able to survive in the sun for a bit longer. Who knows, honestly. But this is Fabian's big goodbye. He has to walk off into the sunset now. One of the most interesting things the game does mechanically is have us play both characters during this scene. I like that quite a bit, and I'm not sure I have ever seen that in a narrative game before. And I will admit, again, credit where credit is due. This scene does hit the emotional crux that it's trying to. It's somber, it's a bit sad, you don't want to see Fabian go. And the whole game has tried to build him up to be a sympathetic, just character that you want to root for. And for the most part, it does that. So seeing him walk off into the sunset is sad. But also at the same time, this scene is basically just this meme.
Anyway, I wanted to ask,
Were you what?
Was I the right partner to you? And to Seattle? To Sophia? To whoever I needed to be there to help?
You have helped guide me, for what it is worth.
But Fabian heads off into the sunset and Fire is back in the present day. Waking up in St. Stephen's as we walk the streets, we see that Sophia has succeeded and the unbirthed are coating the streets in blood. There's this really neat effect where we can see thousands of footprints with our kindred sense. The whole city is silent as well, and one more time, we have to ascend Weaver Tower. We kill marked ghouls on our way up, and reaching the top, we find Sophia standing in a pool of blood overlooking the city. We have our final boss fight with her, which, even though it was the final combat encounter of the game, just made me lose my mind. She has lots of ranged attacks, and we have to attack her ranged a lot as well, which is just relying on the telekinesis system far too much for my liking. Of course, we can use certain powers to get up close and personal, but still. Defeating Sophia, she tries to feed on Fire, but he destroys her before she can do any damage. His mark is finally gone, and we hear Sophia's voice, assumingly because she is now in Fire's head. We then get one of a few different endings. Now, of course, if you made the choice that I did, killing Agent Baker, then you get the bad ending, and the IAO take control of Seattle and kill everybody. This is called the City in Flames ending. Essentially, make this one choice in the game, and you get the bad ending. Sorry. Even though that choice makes a ton of sense if you give it even more than a second of thought. Other than that, I would say there are 3 essentially main endings and a few extra ones. A City Unchained sees Fire taking over and leading Seattle. The ending that you get is sort of determined by the way that you treated people throughout the game, and generally, if someone is asking you your opinion on someone or what you think should happen to the city, then this choice will affect the ending that you get. The conversations that determine this are pretty obvious throughout the course of the game. To get this ending, you have to tell Fabian that you want to be Prince, tell Fabian and Tali that you want to stay in Seattle, and you have to team up with Katsumi against Lou. If you're friendly with Katsumi and plot against Lou and tell Max to help the Anarchs and send the IAO away from Seattle, then you'll probably get the City of Anarchy ending where Katsumi takes over the city. A City Restored involves Lou taking her position back as Prince, and this only occurs if you send away the IAO and threaten to kill Katsumi for Lou, while also being nice to Lou the whole time. The extra endings involve Tali taking over, or one of the 3 clan contacts that you get side quests from taking over, Silky, Fletcher, or Mrs. Thorne. All of these require that you complete the side quests that they give you, so good luck with that. Now, there are multiple problems with the ending of this game. The first is that the endings themselves are unsatisfying and basically the same thing, just with a different person at the head of Seattle. The endings in Bloodlines 1 not only determined who sat at the top at the end of the day, but also the fate of the sarcophagus, and there was a reveal in that as well. Here, it's really just who do you want to rule in your head, and the finale honestly doesn't bring us satisfaction to Fire's story either. He has the sign removed, but then the game just ends. I was at least hoping there would be a point where we got to see Fire truly unchained. That just never happens. The other problem with this ending is the way that we achieve it. We don't get to actually pick our ending like in Bloodlines, or really most narrative RPGs with multiple endings. We aren't allowed to choose a side, it's just chosen for us. Sure, it's based on our actions, but those actions aren't exactly clear. Throughout the whole game, I was trying to get the best ending I could. I was going for a good playthrough. I was being nice to Lou when it was appropriate. I was trying to stick up for the Anarchs when I could. I was helping out at every opportunity. And when I didn't turn Agent Baker, it felt like the right choice as well. I thought at worst I would get an ending where Lou was in charge because she wanted Agent Baker killed, but that didn't happen. No, I just got the worst ending because I made one wrong choice. And at the end of the day, it isn't even a choice, because if you want literally any other ending in the game, you have to turn Agent Baker. That's not a choice, that's the illusion of choice. You have to metagame to be able to get the ending you want on the second playthrough, not roleplay a different character to try and get a different ending. And it's not the Agent Baker choice, it's the whole game. I was never allowed to implement my intentions into the game. When I often wanted to do things, I realized that I just couldn't do them. Towards the end of the game, I wanted to make it clear to Katsumi that I wasn't on Lou's side, but either it was too late or that's just not a choice you can make. I generally didn't like Lou from the beginning and was making pleasantries with her, but the game doesn't read the intention in this, that you're saving face but aren't truly on her side, that you actually are playing the political game that you're supposed to play, because every nice statement is just a nice statement checkbox made to Lou, and that changes her disposition towards you to positive. The game wants you to be immersed and centered into a world that is full of politics, scheming, and backstabbers, but it doesn't really allow you to do that as a player. Maybe that's the point of the game, that Fire, lost to time and not up to speed with the current era and this city, doesn't understand how the politicking works, so you're not able to make these decisions, and thus they are made for you. That's fine, but maybe don't masquerade like choices have impact and that they matter, and that they have this meaningful effect on the game, because at the end of the day, they really don't. One thing that I can't stop thinking about since I made the video on Bloodlines was an interview with Leonard Boyarsky where he talks about the choices in the game, how it isn't necessarily about saying something different on each playthrough. Sometimes you can say the same thing, but in your head the line is read with a different intonation based on the character that you're roleplaying. Sure, Bloodlines 2 allows you to make a Fire that's kind of nice and polite, or a Fire that's a total dick, but that's about it. On a second playthrough, I couldn't get myself to see these lines as any different, even when I was roleplaying a character that, in my head, was different. Because that's not what Bloodlines 2 is. It's a farce, a facade, a carefully constructed shantytown of ramshackle buildings meant to fool you, the player, into thinking it's a high-rise. Step inside and fall to your doom. I've thought a lot about the version of Bloodlines 2 led by Hardsuit Labs and Brian Mitsoda. I've watched the footage of the demo that was released to the public, that version of the game that we never got. It's impossible to know if that game would have been better than what we did get, but from the details that we have, that's a game I'm really interested in playing, a narrative that I'm excited for, a system I want to see, and that's separate from the original Bloodlines. I never needed this game to be exactly like the first game. Honestly, if this game was fantastic, but it had none of the systems or tone that the first game did, I would be sitting here telling you exactly that. But in my opinion, this game has so many problems I can't even count. I just don't want this review to come off as me bitterly tearing down a piece of work because it couldn't match up with a non-existent dream that I had. I would be the first person to eat crow and say I was wrong about my predictions, but Bloodlines 2 fails on nearly every level. Its combat is clunky at best with little to no actual progression. Everything that you're going to achieve with this system is achieved in the first few hours or so. Everything else is just options, not necessarily power or strength. At certain points, the actual movement and fighting does click together, but these moments are fleeting and are quickly lost to strange mechanical decisions that impact the player's ability to do what they want. The narrative is lackluster at best, asking so much of the player that they trust in the pilots so deeply that after 10 hours of turbulence, they'll land the plane safely. And by safely, I mean with minimal injuries that won't keep any passengers out for more than 3 to 9 months. At the end of the game, the plane does land. You got to the destination, but was the ride worth it? Most characters are surface level, often exhibiting nothing past hollow traits quickly listed down on a napkin to describe what they're about. The story itself meanders, often requiring the player to have inconsequential conversations, either to record a response for later or to pad out time so the real narrative can continue. The game tells us that we play an elder, but almost nothing we do makes the player feel like that. And honestly, a lot of this game just doesn't really feel like it's in the world of darkness at all. Some of this could be attributed to the change made to the TTRPG in the time that Bloodlines 1 released and the time the sequel came out. A lot of things changed, so I surely expected some whiplash. Gehenna isn't as much of a thing anymore, different clans are around now, and the overall tone is a bit different. And I certainly didn't enjoy 5e as much as I did Revised, but there are really interesting story ideas from the TTRPG that Bloodlines 2 could have used. Like the Beckoning is a newer phenomenon that's literally only just referenced once in the game, but that could have been used to set up a fantastic tale in this universe. The Beckoning is some sort of mysterious force that's calling elders to the Middle East. No one really knows why, but they're just up and leaving a lot of the time. What if the Beckoning happened in Seattle and there was a massive power vacuum, causing you, a new kindred, to have a chance to take power in that city, or join sides with some of the other factions and help their rise? Maybe putting more of a spotlight on the Second Inquisition than just a few missions at the end of the game. Maybe the IAO is looking to invade the city, and throughout the game your new kindred character is tasked with running them off. A lot of the ideas that Bloodlines 2 has are good in isolation. A Malkavian detective trying to find his lost memories and solve a case he already has. A Sabbat cult secretly trying to usurp the court as revenge for an old friend. A new prince in town, ready to prove herself and shirk off the old chains of her sire. And it's not that the game has too many of these in one, I just think that the developers couldn't properly handle all of these ideas and give them their proper due. Odds are we'll never really know why Bloodlines 2 came out like this. I can't imagine that this is the final version of the game that the Chinese room wanted to make. Maybe I'm wrong and they're happy with the end product. Maybe they just made some bad decisions along the way. Maybe Paradox felt like they wasted too much time and money on the original version of Bloodlines 2 and they needed to get the sequel out as fast as possible. Who knows? But at the end of the day, Bloodlines 2 feels like a hollow attempt at creating a new story in this world, one that doesn't feel like it has any real impact or heft behind it, one that's cold, silent unlife fails to ever reach out from the screen and make contact with the player, a shadow box of illusion and deception. Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines 2 was met with mixed reception from fans and critics alike. It currently has mixed review status on Steam, a 62 on Metacritic for the PC version, and a 4.6 user score. The game underperformed in sales, with Paradox CEO Frederick Wester taking responsibility for the poor numbers and claiming that the game was outside of their core areas, which probably means that we won't be getting any more games like this in the world of darkness, at least not in the near future. The developers have released a roadmap, plans to introduce an FOV slider and motion blur toggle, as well as improved progress saving before the end of the year, and also a winter update with Christmas-themed cosmetics and custom difficulty. But as this roadmap was released almost a month ago as of writing this, I'm not sure those dates will even be met. Not like this would fix the game or anything. We'll see what the DLC looks like next year, but I don't have high hopes for those. I've talked about Bloodlines 1 and 2, but next, I'd like to go back further into the past to talk about a Vampire the Masquerade game that I think most have forgotten about at this point. But we'll talk about that next time. Bye, Dad.